Chapter 617. We have to come up with a solution. Fortunately, we are the ones attacking and the enemy won't dare to attack us. We still have the initiative. We have time to think of a solution. Fan Yuhai frowned. Godin claimed to be a famous general in Siam, but his temper was a little too bad. On the battlefield, victory and defeat were common. If they lost this time, they would find the reason and win the next time. What was the use of getting angry? All right, let's think of a solution quickly. I can't wait to attack Wanxiang City. Not only will I kill the mercenaries guarding the city, but I won't let the civilians off either. I want them to die. I want them to be terrified. In the future, if anyone mentions my name, they will have to keep quiet and avoid me. Godin, who was still in a state of rage, had a furious look on his face as if he was really infuriated. Wait. On the other hand, Fan Yuhai wasn't affected by Godin's emotions. Instead, he was moved after hearing Godin's words. After about 3 breaths, he suddenly clapped his hands and laughed. Yes, that's it. I've already thought of a way to break the enemy's landmines. Seeing that Fan Yuhai had come up with a solution so quickly, Godin looked at Fan Yuhai in confusion as if saying, "Can you do it or not? Don't try to fool me with a random solution and make me lose more soldiers." General Godin, didn't you mention the civilians just now? Let's let the civilians walk in front. Do you remember what I told you a while ago? Look for the civilians in Siam. As long as we gather them and push them to the front line, they will step on the landmines. Won't we be able to break the enemy's formation easily? Fan Yuhai laughed. Godin was the best at making use of the civilians. He used this method when he was fighting with the mercenaries previously. However, he was confused by the mercenaries' retreat. Then his plan was broken during the counterattack at night. He had no choice but to give up on this idea. This time, with so many landmines in front of him, he couldn't help but think of this matter again. Moreover, he could guarantee that this method would be effective this time. Godin was also a demon who killed without batting an eyelid. Not to mention the Hans, he would not hesitate to sacrifice his own citizens or even his own soldiers. Hence, he would definitely not reject such a method to make use of the Hans. Good. General Fan is indeed smart. Since that's the case, this general will immediately give the order to gather all the Han citizens in the nearby cities and send them to the front lines. When Godin heard Fan Yuhai's words, he had really arranged for his men to count the number of Han citizens in his territory. However, it was just a count. The arrogant him did not think that he would need to use any methods to deal with the 10,000+ mercenaries. However, it was different now. The appearance of landmines gave him a huge headache. Since the Han people were useful, he would capture all the people who did the statistics. However, this would take a few days. Godin thought that he had grasped the method to deal with the mercenaries. However, what he did not know was that as his troops approached Wanxiang City, he initiated a provocation. This was equivalent to giving the mercenaries an excuse to deal a heavy blow to Siam. Some people would ask, Yang Chendong is leading the 2nd and 3rd regiments of the 1st Division of the Cold Front Division into the territory of the Phnom Penh dynasty. Most of the Navy's Cold Front Division can only be on duty at sea. Now that Wanxiang City is under siege by the enemy, where are the soldiers coming from? Don't forget, before the war started, when the matter with the Salangan family was still brewing, Yang Chendong had disappeared for a period of time. It was during that period of time that he had already set up a trap for Siam. At that time, he thought that once the mercenaries and the Phnom Penh dynasty started a war, this country would definitely be restless. Since Yang Chendong was personally involved, how could the battle array be too small? Otherwise, it would not match his status. In fact, the commander that he left behind in Siam was one of the 2 heads of Yang Xie's military, the commander of the 1st Division of the Cold Front Division, Lung Song. Wulongu was also known as Wulong Thani City. It was one of the biggest cities in the north of Siam. At the same time, it was also the rear of Gordon's 100,000 soldiers. It was used to provide military supplies and for emergency use. However, there were only 50,000 soldiers here. 500 of them were sent to capture the Han civilians. At this moment, such a large city was secretly surrounded by the mercenaries led by Commander Lung Song. 20 days ago, Leng Song was ordered by Yang Chendong to secretly enter the country with the 1st Regiment of the 1st Division and 8 auxiliary battalions. They hid in the dense forest. They even saw with their own eyes that Gordon led 100,000 soldiers out of Wulonga City and headed straight for Wanxiang City. At that time, they could have set up an ambush. However, Leng Song did not do so. After that, they saw the 50,000 soldiers out of the city. However, they still did not make a move. In Yang Chendong's words, now was not the time to start a full-scale war with Siam. If they took the initiative to attack, it would be unjustifiable. Their military strength was limited. This was the shortcoming of the mercenaries. In a war where they could not win, such a war was not worth the effort. After seeing another 50,000 soldiers pass by, Leng Song immediately carried out the military operation plan formulated by the 6th young master. He started to plan for Wulonga City. The plan was divided into 3 parts. First, secretly enter Wulonga City and attack them from the inside. Second, severely injure the 50,000 soldiers of Siam and burn their military supplies and provisions. They would have no choice but to return. Third, when Gordon returned, the mercenaries would give up on Wulonga City and ambush them. They would try their best to eliminate their forces so that they would not have the energy to invade Wanxiang City. As long as these 3 points were achieved, Yang Chendong would have enough time to settle the matter of the Phnom Penh dynasty and reach the final conclusion of the peace talks. Yes, this time Yang Chendong did not intend to swallow the Phnom Penh dynasty. He did not have such a big appetite. He had not even occupied Vietnam and Laos for a long time. The internal affairs had not been settled yet. How could he take over the Phnom Penh dynasty? If he really did that, there would not be enough manpower to protect and manage the place. It would only benefit other countries. Yang Chendong would not do such a loss-making deal. Leng Song quietly left Chichen City. Although he was the commander of a division and the only division commander in the army, he would be credited for any results that the Leng vanguard achieved on the front line. However, how could the fruits of victory be better than the fruits of victory obtained by himself? This time, Yang Chen finally transferred him out and gave him great expectations. Leng Song held his breath in his heart. Not only did he have to complete the task, but he also had to complete the task at the smallest cost. He had to show the heads of his subordinates that he didn't rely on his seniority, but he had the real ability. He had great ambitions and was especially attentive in executing the 6th young master's military plan. He first sent people to disguise themselves as the Phnom Penh dynasty's caravan and entered Wulong City. In order not to attract attention, the Leng vanguard entered the city in groups of 3 to 5 people and kept a low profile. They entered different inns in the city like a drop of water thrown into a river. No one would have thought that the enemy would suddenly appear behind them. In addition, there was only 1 battalion of the Leng vanguard that entered the city. The 400 people were divided into many groups and entered the city separately. For a city with a population of 100,000 people and 50,000 soldiers, this number of people was really nothing. They did not reveal themselves. A battalion of the Leng vanguard entered the city, indicating that the first step of the plan was successful. After the news of Gordon attacking Wanxiang City came, they had an excuse to start the war. Now they would fight in self-defense. Leng Song arranged for his scouts to enter the city and contact the Leng vanguard warriors. They decided to attack Wulong City tonight. The battalion commander of the 1st Regiment's 3rd Battalion, Xiao Yining, entered the city. This person had displayed astonishing leadership skills in the process of reclaiming and pacifying Ryukyu Island. In addition, he was qualified. Thus, he naturally became the 3rd Battalion commander of the 1st Regiment. Many people were envious that he could enter the 1st Regiment and become a battalion commander of the Leng Vanguard Battalion. But to him, this was nothing. His goal in life was not limited to being a battalion commander. In his opinion, he should at least be a division commander. Only then would it be awe-inspiring and be considered a true glory. There was no need to doubt the ability of a person with such ambitions. After secretly meeting with the scouts in the city and receiving the new military order, Xiao Yining began to run around, quickly contacting all his subordinates. They agreed that they would act in the middle of the night to take down Wulongnan city gate and lead the main army into the city. Compared to the flames of war on the front lines, there were soldiers and horses. Wulong City, which was at the rear, could be said to be peaceful and prosperous. They were also fighting with mercenaries. As the main attacker, there was naturally no pressure. Furthermore, Siam's military strength had always been at the top of the nearby countries. This made them think that they were saints and everyone else was mortals. With such an arrogant mentality and the stimulation of the 50,000 Siam soldiers entering the city, the entire Wulong city fell into a false state of prosperity. With a large population, it was naturally easy to do all kinds of business. For example, the restaurants, casinos, and especially the brothels in the city were filled with people and were extremely lively. Even if the front lines reported that the attack was not going well, it did not seem to affect them much. They could do whatever they wanted and enjoy themselves as much as they wanted. Of course, they did not do nothing. For example, after receiving General Gordon's orders, they sent out 50,000 soldiers to capture the Han people in other cities and towns. Chapter 6:18. Just like how Yang Chendong would think that those who were not of the same race were not of the same race. The people of Siam also had the same thought. No matter how many years these Han people had lived in their country, as long as they were Han people or their descendants, they were not to be trusted. Their status was also the lowest. Now that they had to capture these people, the soldiers sent out to carry out this mission did not feel any burden at all. It was as if it was only right to treat the Han people however they wanted. The soldiers swaggered through the streets and left. Naturally, their mission was leaked. When Xiao Yining heard that the enemy troops were going to capture Han people, he sensed that something was wrong. This made him even more determined to take action tonight. When the news reached the ears of the other Lung Feng soldiers, they were enraged. They could not wait to destroy Wulong City and disrupt the enemy's plan. Amidst the torment, night finally arrived. The sky was getting darker and darker. When the watches of the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion of the Cold Front Battalion showed 11 o'clock at night, they began to walk out of the inns. Then, like ghosts in the night, they split into dozens of groups and slowly and carefully moved toward the southern gate of Wulong City. The Siamese soldiers were too careless. They did not expect the enemy to infiltrate their rear. The soldiers guarding the gate were completely unprepared. Originally, there were 1,000 soldiers guarding the gate. However, there were less than 300 soldiers left. The other 700 soldiers had applied for leave to play in the city. Arrogance and arrogance were bad habits that should not exist in an army. If an army had these habits, it could only be said that they were not far from being destroyed. When Xiao Yining led the 400 Lung Feng soldiers to the south gate, he saw the enemy's morale was low. Wait a minute, something is not right. Seeing that there were only about 300 enemies in front of him, Xiao Yining instinctively stopped moving forward. He led the soldiers to hide in the shadows. Go, find the brothers who stayed here. Without Xiao Yining's order, the Lung Feng soldiers who stayed here to observe the situation found him first. They then explained the situation to him. Battalion commander, the enemy did not notice us. There should be 1,000 soldiers here, but most of them applied for leave to play in the city. Even the Chiliarch left. Is that so? Xiao Yining was shocked when he heard this. He didn't dare to think that something like this could happen. If something similar happened in Lungfeng, everyone from the highest officer to the lowest squad leader would be punished. They would be given demerits, and it was even possible that they would be expelled from the military. Needless to say, the Siamese soldiers were truly blessed. Of course, some happiness came at a heavy price, such as one's life. Good, it's good that the enemy is not prepared. This is our chance. The Xiao family wanted to laugh out loud. They looked at the watch on their wrist. It was 11:45. There was still a quarter of an hour left. With Lung Feng's ability, he had more than enough time to prepare. Inform everyone to begin the operation. No one is to make a sound, and no one is to fire. Turn off the safety. I will punish whoever drops the ball later. The Xiao family's expression was stern as they issued the military order in a cold voice. Lung Feng and his brothers, who had been impatient for a long time, quickly formed groups of 3 and crept towards the 300 enemies that were still illuminated by the torches. Even though there were only 300 people left, they were obviously distracted. They were either leaning against the wall, half squatting on the ground, or leaning against each other. They were all resting with their eyes closed. Perhaps, in their subconscious, they didn't even think about the danger they would face if they stayed here. Without the slightest bit of alertness, Lung Feng's mission was very easy. They only needed to keep an eye on the target, walk behind or beside the target, and then cover the target's mouth with their large hands. Their left hand, which held a military knife, gently cut forward. Bright red blood spurted out and a life was lost. The eyes closed forever, and there was no longer any breath. Perhaps some of the Siamese soldiers struggled before they died, but under Lung Feng's large hands, their struggles and resistance were futile. They only sped up their blood flow, but it didn't change the situation at all. Outside the torches, the Siamese soldiers were silently slaughtered one after another. In just 5 minutes, more than 100 enemies outside the perimeter were all killed. There was no sound or movement from the beginning to the end. This was the strength of the Lung Feng, and it was the result of their training. It was another kind of report. After the enemies outside the perimeter were all killed, the next target was the 100 enemies under the torches at the city gate. It was unrealistic to try and assassinate them one by one, but Xiao Yining wasn't afraid. He waved his hand, and a portion of the 1st Company and 2nd Company of the 3rd Battalion quickly approached the city gate with him. They moved cautiously, and even though it was only a distance of 100 meters, it actually took them more than 5 minutes to walk. During this time, the 100 people didn't make any noise other than the sound of their breathing. Finally, they approached the south gate. Xiao Yining was the first to pounce forward like a tiger. Within a breath, more than 100 Lung Feng did the same. Puff, puff, puff. The military knives silently pierced the chests of the Siamese soldiers. The intense pain immediately woke them up. Some of them even wanted to scream before they died, but when a large hand appeared in front of their eyes and reached their mouths, everything was over. A total of 300 enemies, except for one Siamese soldier who was stabbed in the wrong spot and died after a scream. The other 299 people didn't have the chance to make a sound. Xiao Yining stared at the Lung Feng who made a mistake. Fortunately, there were no more enemies at the south gate. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster. Open the gate, send the signal, and lead the army into the city. Xiao Yining immediately stopped and ordered. There were only 2 minutes left until midnight. Outside the south gate, Lung Song led the 1st and 2nd Battalions and 8 auxiliary battalions of the 1st Battalion to wait. Everyone's eyes were resolute as they stared straight ahead. They didn't even blink for a long time. Commander, there are only 2 minutes left. Will Battalion Commander Xiao and his men encounter any problems? Political Commissar Mo Qingyu asked worriedly. Commander, why don't I lead my men up the tower? I don't mean to brag, but this tower is only a dozen meters tall. My men and I will only need a minute to climb it. 2nd Battalion Commander Ling Daqiang sounded more anxious as he spoke in a hoarse voice. Don't we still have 2 minutes? Let's wait a little longer. We have to have faith in Battalion Commander Xiao, Lung Song said calmly. How could he not know the capabilities of his own battalion commander and Lung Feng? Even if there was an accident, he should have heard gunshots. However, there was no movement, so why was he so anxious? As soon as Lung Song finished speaking, the south gate 400 meters away slowly opened from the inside. A bright torch appeared and flickered 3 times to the left and 3 times to the right. How we did it? Battalion Commander Ling Daqiang couldn't help but laugh excitedly. He could finally enter the city and start a massacre. During this period of time, the 1st Regiment had been carrying out missions in Crimson City, dealing with the captives and other matters that were sent to the island. He was already tired of it and couldn't wait to show off his skills on the battlefield. Now, the opportunity had finally presented itself. That's our secret signal. Advance. Lung Song carefully looked through the night vision binoculars. After confirming that it was Xiao Yining's secret signal, he gave the order. Then, the 4,000 mercenaries stood up from the ground and crazily rushed forward. In front of the south gate, The city gate had been completely opened, allowing the mercenaries to rush in. Lung Song appeared in front of Xiao Yining along with the army. Battalion Commander Xiao, you've worked hard. How's the situation? Commander, the south gate has been controlled. The enemies in the city have no other defenses. Xiao Yining gave a standard military salute and replied. Very good. Lung Song nodded approvingly. This result was better than he expected. Originally, he thought that with 400 mercenaries against 1,000, they would have to make some noise. That way, the city gate could be opened, but the enemy would be alerted and counterattack. But now, the city gate was occupied, and the enemy was kept in the dark. This way, they had more time to set up their plans. Since the enemy hasn't noticed, we can't follow the first plan. Let's go with the second plan. Lung Song said in high spirits. The second plan was to enter the city without alerting the enemy. Then, with the Cold Vanguard Company and the Auxiliary Battalion as one unit, they would march separately. This way, his troops would be divided into 21 units. If they appeared in various parts of the city and fought at night, it would give the enemy the impression that they were everywhere. With more than 4,000 men, they would be able to unleash 10 times the power. It would be more effective in conquering and destroying Wulong City. Fortunately, Lung Song had prepared the second plan. Although at that time, he didn't think it would work. However, due to the carelessness of the Siamese soldiers and the perfect performance of Xiao Yining's 3 battalions, the second plan could be implemented. Suppressing his excitement, Lung Song gathered the 13 company commanders of Lung Feng and the 8 battalion commanders of Lung Feng. Follow Plan 2. Get to the designated location as fast as you can. Remember, try not to make any noise before you get there. Even if you accidentally encounter an enemy, it's best if you can deal with them without making a sound. When it's 1 o'clock, everyone will attack with all their might. Understood? Chapter 619. Lung Song held a map of Wulong City that he had prepared a long time ago and spoke to his subordinates. Familiarize yourself with your destination. If you don't understand, come and ask me. Now, I will give you 5 minutes to prepare and assemble your troops before we depart. Before they came, the officers had already imprinted the first and second plans in their minds. How could anyone not be familiar with them now? Therefore, after nodding their heads, they went to gather their troops and instructed them to not make any noise as much as possible and to arrive at the designated location as quietly as possible. If they wanted to kill the enemy, they would start from one point and kill as much as they wanted. 5 minutes later, the unit furthest away from their destination set off. Then, the second unit, the third unit. Soon, Lung Song and Political Commissar Mo Qingyu also disappeared from the south gate. In less than 10 minutes, everything returned to normal. Only the night breeze could be heard. At this time, Wulong City was shrouded in darkness and silence. It was already past 12 o'clock. Those who wanted to sleep had already gone to sleep. Those who wanted to play had already found a place to bury their souls. Everything seemed to be the same as usual, until the sound of swords clashing could be heard on the street, breaking the silence of the street. They were the 100 soldiers guarding the south gate. Because they had lost all their money in gambling, they had no choice but to leave early. Unfortunately, they bumped into a group of mercenaries who were rushing towards their destination on the street. The two sides suddenly met on the street. On one side, there were 100 gamblers who had lost all their money. On the other side, there were 400 auxiliary soldiers. After the two sides looked at each other, a short battle began. The 100 Siamese soldiers who did not bring any weapons were the ones being slaughtered. However, they still screamed before they died. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! In the silence of the night, the screams spread far and wide. It also attracted the attention of the nearby residents. The commotion was getting louder and louder. Battalion commander, what should we do? A company commander stabbed the last Siamese soldier to death on the ground with a bayonet. He turned around and asked the battalion commander, "Don't think too much about it. Go to the rendezvous point as fast as you can." The auxiliary battalion commander secretly cursed his bad luck, but he didn't panic. This was just a warm-up before the big battle. The team of 400 people quickly left. When the people nearby came out to take a look, they saw the ground full of corpses and the smell of blood. Ah! Someone screamed first. Then, similar screams came one after another. The commotion spread far and wide. Finally, the people on the other side of the street were alerted. Then, the Siamese soldiers in the city also received the news. The hour hand was approaching 12:50. There were still 10 minutes before the general attack. Except for a few small teams that were further away from the destination, most of the soldiers had already arrived at the designated location. However, the streets were already bustling with activity. The death of more than 100 Siamese soldiers was definitely a big case, and it attracted the attention of many people. Many Siamese captains, chiliarchs, and centurions who received the news were rushing over with their men. Even at this moment, they still didn't think that they were in danger. They just thought that some fugitive and his subordinates had bumped into each other and got into a fight. The hour hand kept moving. Finally, it pointed to the final destination, 1 o'clock in the morning. Send the signal. Commander Lung Song's voice trembled. He was excited. As soon as he finished speaking, a bright red signal flare rose into the sky and lit up the sky. Following which, gunshots and grenades rang out all over the city. The all-out attack had begun. At this moment, Wulong City had turned into a city of fire. Flames shot out in all directions, incessant and endless. The power of the Type 95 and the Type 81 assault rifle formed an impenetrable fire net. All the Siamese soldiers in front of them became live targets. Whenever the soldiers gathered together to form a dense charge, a series of grenades would end their lives. Their bodies were thrown high into the air before they fell heavily to the ground. Any Siamese who walked on the streets, whether they were generals or soldiers, armed or ordinary civilians, became targets for the mercenaries. They were like food in the eyes of a beast. They were constantly bitten and devoured. They died or were injured. There were gunshots everywhere and enemies were everywhere. It gave people a feeling that there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to hide. It seemed that at this moment, no place was safe. No place was heaven. Charge. Charge out. Report this to General Gordon. We must charge out. The 5 captains of the Siamese army in the city shouted at the top of their lungs. It seemed that if they didn't do this, they would lose all hope. Retreat. Retreat to the south gate. After an hour of continuous gunshots, the Siamese soldiers gradually came to their senses. After a few consecutive charges and countless deaths, they finally understood how terrifying their opponents were. At this moment, no one was thinking about fighting with the enemy who had entered the city. They only had one thought in their minds, and that was to retreat. They had to escape and leave this hell on earth. Gunshots were heard intermittently throughout the night. When the sky finally brightened, the streets were littered with corpses. From time to time, among the crowds, there were survivors who were injured and wailing. Many places in the city were on fire. The places where food and weapons were stored were severely damaged. Even when the sky brightened, the fire showed no signs of stopping. It was still burning fiercely. The mercenaries had retreated, leaving behind a city full of corpses and injured soldiers. According to the statistics, more than 60,000 soldiers and civilians of Siam were killed or injured in this battle. At least half of them were burned by the fire and trampled to death. In fact, only about 10,000 people died in the hands of the mercenaries. The warehouse was burned. Apart from the corpses and the injured soldiers who could not be moved, there was no one left in the city. The scariest thing about this battle was that they didn't know who did it, and they didn't know how many enemies there were. They only knew from the survivors' descriptions that there should be a lot of enemies, and they seemed to be everywhere. Moreover, they all had very powerful rifles in their hands, and they even suspected that the other side had cannons. Otherwise, why would there be the sound of explosions from time to time? It was unknown whether outsiders believed in such a statement, but the people living in Wulong City firmly believed in it. Because on this night, at least half of the 100,000 people were affected. Their families and friends were either killed or injured. Out of the 50,000 Siamese soldiers, more than 10,000 were killed and 10,000 were injured. The remaining 30,000 soldiers were lucky enough to escape. They did not dare to stay in the vicinity. Instead, they went straight to Kongjing City, which was south of Wulong City. From afar, the 30,000 soldiers looked like a group of homeless people. They wore tattered uniforms, their eyes were lifeless, and their morale was low. Most of them did not even know where their weapons were when they escaped. At this moment, who would dare to believe that this was an army with level 3 combat power? Were they supposed to be the elite soldiers of Siam? In a dense forest about 10 miles south of Wulong City, Lung Song was leading his army to reorganize themselves. After a night of battle, they had achieved their goal. Especially after burning the enemy's military supplies and provisions, General Gordon had no choice but to retreat. How is it? How is the count of the casualties? Although Lung Song also felt a little tired, as a commander, he naturally couldn't just fall asleep like ordinary soldiers. There was still too much work for him to do. He needed to preside over and make decisions. Commander, Lung Fong has returned. There are only 2 injured soldiers. However, it is not a big problem. They just need to rest for a while to recover their combat power. 7 auxiliary soldiers died and 200 were injured. 3 of them were seriously injured. The rest only had light injuries. The political commissar of the 1st Regiment, Mo Qingyu, looked at the statistics of the battalions and reported to Lung Song. Arrange for a platoon of auxiliary soldiers to send the 3 seriously injured soldiers away. The rest of you should take the time to rest. In the afternoon, dig out the ammunition buried in the forest. Replenish them and be ready for battle. Hearing that Lung Fong did not suffer any losses and only lost a few auxiliary soldiers, Lung Song felt some heartache. However, overall he was satisfied with the results. Lung Fong was indeed Lung Fong. Not only was he good at killing the enemy, he was also good at protecting himself on the battlefield. Especially when it came to city warfare in the middle of the night. Who knows how many times they had practiced it? Their hard work had finally paid off. As the commander, Lung Song was also proud of it. Immediately report to the 6th young master about our results. Also, tell him that we are not going to go deeper into Siam. We are going to stay here and ambush Gudan. Last night's battle at Wulong City went too smoothly. Lung Song's side did not suffer any losses and they were able to safely retreat from the city. This gave Lung Song a lot of confidence in the upcoming battle plan. Since he was leading the 1st Regiment of Lung Fong and 8 auxiliary battalions, they should be the main force. Wherever they go, they should be able to kill the enemy until they can't find their way north. As the saying goes, it is better to break 1 finger than to injure all 10. Lung Song decided to show Gudan his power. It would be best if he could kill this person. If he could not kill him, he would at least severely injure him. This way, when Gudan thought about hiring mercenaries in the future, he would tremble without a fight. After the telegram was sent out, Yang Chendong, who was in Phnom Penh Dynasty, received the report. He immediately gave orders and agreed to Lung Song's request for battle. However, he also gave his own suggestion. If they could fight, then they should fight. If they could not fight, then they should not force themselves. It was more important to preserve their own strength. Chapter 620. Below Wanxiang City, there was a short period of peace after the battle. The power of the landmines had frightened General Gordon. He was not prepared to launch any more attacks before the Han civilians from the rear were sent up. Since he was the one attacking the city, he had the initiative. Furthermore, Wulong City had already prepared food for the army. There would not be any problems defending the city for a few months. Since there was no need to go to war for the time being, General Gordon summoned the singers who followed the army and held a party in his tent. He also called his generals and General Fan Yuhai to enjoy the joy of the interlude between wars. 8 young women with great figures were dressed in faintly discernible gauze. Their waists were swaying in the tent. Gordon and the other generals sat around them and laughed from time to time. Their gazes followed the movements of the women as they enjoyed the feast that was brought to their eyes. Gordon, who was sitting at the front, had already set his goal of warming the bed tonight. He wanted to fight for 300 rounds to get rid of the bad luck on his body. Just as he was indulging in his fantasies, a bodyguard quietly entered the tent with an ugly expression. He walked to his ear and whispered in a low voice. "What?" Suddenly, Godin's face turned red, and the wine cup in his hand flew out with a bang. This movement attracted the attention of the other generals, and the 8 women screamed in shock. "Scream, scream, what are you screaming for? Get out of here." Gordon waved his hand. At this moment, his eyes were filled with a strong murderous aura. It was as if he would kill anyone who dared to appear in front of him and offend him. The 8 singers hurriedly left the tent, leaving behind only a few generals in the tent. Fan Yuhai raised his eyebrows and then frowned deeply. He had a feeling that something bad was about to happen. "General, what happened?" A captain who was Gordon's absolute confidant asked in confusion. "Something happened. Wulong City was invaded last night. Our 50,000-strong army was defeated and was forced to retreat to the south. Our rations and weapons in the city were all burned. Damn it." First, he used a calm voice to report what he had just heard. Then, killing intent burst out from his eyes. It was as though he wanted to materialize a saber light to kill someone. There was silence in the tent as everyone digested Godin's words. However, very soon, a general said in disbelief, "That's impossible. We are right here. The 4 gates of Wanxiang City are tightly shut. It's impossible for them to send an army to surround us." "That's right. The Lao's army won't go around us. The armies of other countries are all our allies. They won't attack us secretly. Could it be the work of mercenaries? But how did they get behind us? Could it be that they fell from the sky?" "We launched the first attack 2 days ago, and those people took action at night. That's too fast. Even if they are mercenaries, it's impossible for them to send out their troops in such a short time. They must have bypassed us to attack. There are 50,000 of our soldiers in the city. Even if they are mercenaries, they won't be able to occupy the entire Wulong City if they don't have enough soldiers. It's even more impossible for them to inflict heavy damage on our army. Could it be the work of other countries?" The generals below spoke one after another. They mentioned various possibilities, but they were all rejected one by one. Godin's face darkened. He didn't speak. According to the battle report, the people who came were armed with advanced firearms, so they should be mercenaries. However, the battle report didn't mention the number of soldiers. What did that mean? Did they forget to mention it? That was impossible. There could only be one answer. They still didn't know how many enemies there were. Half of the 50,000-strong army was blasted out of Wulong City. They didn't even know how many enemies there were. How terrifying was that? Didn't that mean that the enemy had a lot of soldiers? However, wasn't the main force of the mercenaries taken away by the Ming dynasty's Duke of Loyalty to attack the Phnom Penh dynasty? Where did the enemy come from? Godin was deep in thought. The generals were also deep in thought. Even Fan Yuhai was deep in thought. The only difference was that Fan Yuhai had locked the enemy on the mercenaries even though he didn't get any accurate information. In his eyes, he was very clear about the military strength of the surrounding countries. Only the mercenaries could break into the city and defeat the 50,000-strong Siamese soldiers in one night. However, how did they appear there? After all, they had only appeared at Wanxiang City 2 days ago and launched their first attack. How could the mercenaries react so quickly? The entire battle took less than 5 days. Even a flying man couldn't have done it. Unless, when he thought of the only possibility, Fan Yuhai's expression changed drastically. Could it be that the mercenaries were already prepared and knew that they would attack Wanxiang City? Hence, they planted a large number of soldiers behind them. If that was the case, once the Siamese army launched their attack, the mercenaries started their attack on Wulong City? Yes, that must be it. If all of this was true, the Ming dynasty's Duke of Loyalty was too good at scheming. His attacks were ruthless and the military strength behind him was much stronger than what was shown. He even had the ability to split his troops to attack Siamese and the Phnom Penh dynasty. But it should be more than that. Since he had arranged a backup plan in Siamese, his other ally, the Kingdom of Ava, must have also arranged a backup plan. This? Fan Yuhai sucked in a breath of cold air. At this moment, Fan Yuhai suddenly felt that Yang Chendong was very terrifying. This person was not only good at calculation, but also had a more outstanding military vision than ordinary people. He also had powerful firearms and an unknown military strength. How could such an opponent be defeated? Question marks flashed in his mind. At this moment, Fan Yuhai suddenly had an idea. He wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. He had repeatedly challenged the mercenaries and Yang Chendong. First, he led the Lansong kingdom into the whirlpool of war. Then, the Lansong kingdom was destroyed. Then, he had the idea of forming an alliance between the three countries. However, now that the Phnom Penh dynasty and Siamese kingdom had been attacked to different degrees, as the initiator, how could he not be targeted by Yang Chendong? If Yang Chendong really wanted to deal with him, would he be able to stay safe with his 5,000 elite cavalry? No, such a person was too dangerous. He had to leave this place first. At least before he had enough strength, he would not appear in front of Yang Chendong. When he appeared again, he had to make all the necessary preparations. After making up his mind, Fan Yuhai did not speak anymore. He did not even have the intention to help General Gordon analyze the situation. He kept his mouth shut. "General, I don't think it's the time to talk about this. Even if Wulong City's provisions have been burned, we have to be prepared to leave this place. Otherwise, if the enemy behind us and the enemy in Wanxiang City attack us from both sides, how are we going to face them? Besides, if the army loses its provisions, it will definitely cause chaos. We have to leave this place quickly while the soldiers below are still unaware. We have to gather new provisions for the next battle," one of the generals said after analyzing the gains and losses. The other generals nodded in agreement. "That's right, General. We have to retreat. Yes, we have to leave. We can't let them attack us from both sides." Gordon slammed the table and said. Then he looked around and fixed his gaze on Fan Yuhai. "General Fan, what do you think?" Fan Yuhai wanted to say, "If we leave now, aren't you afraid that the mercenaries will attack us halfway?" However, he thought that if he reminded Gordon, he would definitely hold his ground. Who knew what the mercenaries would do? If they were really attacked from both sides, wouldn't it be very dangerous for him and Gordon to stay together? Since that was the case, it was better to let them leave. At that time, whether or not they were attacked by the mercenaries, they would escape halfway. At least he would be safe. The world was big, but he was the most important. Fan Yuhai nodded. "It's time to leave. How about this? I will bring my 5,000 cavalrymen and retreat last, just in case. Sigh, speaking of which, my cavalrymen were not of much use in this siege. I feel ashamed." He wanted to hear Fan Yuhai's opinion, but he did not expect him to take the initiative to bring up the rear. This made Gordon's eyes brighten. He sighed and said, "General Fan is a righteous man. Thank you for your hard work. Don't worry, if the mercenaries catch up from behind, you only have to hold them off for a while. I will send reinforcements to support you." "Okay, thank you." Fan Yuhai stood up and cupped his fist with a sincere face. However, he thought coldly in his heart, "Who would believe that you would come to my aid when I am attacked?" With someone bringing up the rear, it was much easier to retreat. In order to prevent any accidents from happening, Gordon decided on the spot to retreat now. They would rush through the night and try to reach Wulong City the day after tomorrow. At that time, they would guard the city tightly and ask the king for rations so that they could regroup and fight again. With all the generals present, there was no need for a meeting. Soon, the order was given and the generals went to prepare. After 2 hours, the army had already packed up their tents and started to retreat towards Wulong City. Then, the rest of the army followed suit and left Wanxiang City in a long line. On the tower in the south of Wanxiang City, General Higuang was looking at the scene before him through a pair of binoculars. Because of the landmines, Luan Shaochen did not stay on the tower. There were too many things in the city that he needed to deal with, so he left everything here to Higuang. Because of this, he was also confused when he saw that the enemy had actually started to retreat. Chapter 621. He raised his binoculars again and again to make sure that he was not mistaken. The enemy had indeed retreated. He quickly said to the messenger beside him, "Go and inform Governor Luan that the situation has changed. Ask him to come here as soon as possible." Half an hour later, Luan Xiaochen arrived at the gate tower on his bicycle. When he arrived at the gate tower, he listened to Higuang's report and raised his binoculars as well. He saw the Siamese army retreating. How long have they been doing this? Luan Xiaochen put down his binoculars and was puzzled. Reporting to the governor, "They have been retreating since half an hour ago. I have calculated that the number of retreating soldiers has exceeded 10,000, and it seems like they will continue to retreat," Higuang reported with a face full of doubts. "So, they have really retreated? What?" Luan Xiaochen could not figure it out and frowned. "I don't know," Higuang answered honestly. He wanted to ask Governor Luan why. Higuang knew that it would be useless to ask Higuang. He thought for a moment and said to the messenger beside him, "Turn on the radio immediately and contact the 6th young master. Report the situation here as it is." The waiting time was always long. On the open land 5 miles away from the gate tower, the Siamese army was still retreating. Just from the looks of it, they should be serious. However, this was even more puzzling. The attack was only temporarily blocked, and only a few thousand of the 100,000 soldiers died. Why did they stop fighting? The morale of this army was too low. "Sir, the 6th young master has called back." The messenger ran all the way to Luan Xiaochen and handed him a telegram. Luan Xiaochen, who was puzzled, quickly picked up the telegram. After a few glances, he could not help but shout excitedly, "Good, good, ah." Higuang, who was beside him, was even more confused. "Governor Luan, what did the 6th young master say?" "Here, take a look at it yourself." Luan Xiaochen was in a good mood at that moment, so he casually handed the telegram to Higuang. After reading it once, her eyes widened in disbelief. She couldn't help but read it again. Then, with a surprised look on her face, she said, "The 6th young master said that the mercenaries attacked Wulong City and defeated the 50,000 Siamese soldiers there. They even burned the enemy's provisions? This is too powerful, but where did the mercenaries come from?" Luan Xiaochen also couldn't figure it out, but he wouldn't show it in front of his subordinates. As a superior, it was appropriate for him to remain mysterious in front of his subordinates. Thus, he chuckled and said, "This is not something you should consider. You only need to know that Wanxiang City is safe." Yes. Higuang also knew that he couldn't be fully trusted by the mercenaries right now. There were some things that he couldn't ask casually. However, now that Wanxiang City was safe and the Siamese soldiers were retreating, he was wondering if he could take advantage of the situation. Thus, he told Luan Xiaochen his thoughts. When he heard Higuang say that he wanted to go out and fight a drowning dog, Luan Xiaochen thought for a while and shook his head. "We have too few soldiers. If we go out, it will be dangerous. If the enemy counterattacks, the consequences will be unimaginable. It's better not to take the risk." There was only one company of soldiers guarding the city, 2 auxiliary battalions, and 10,000 Laotian mercenaries. If they really went out, only the auxiliary soldiers of the Lung vanguard would be able to take advantage of the situation. However, their numbers were too small. Instead of taking the risk and reaping huge rewards, it was better to stay put. After all, there would be more battles in the future. These were the words of an experienced strategist. Luan Xiaochen made this decision because the number of soldiers he had was limited. They could defend the city, but it wasn't enough to go out and kill the enemy. Secondly, the 6th young master's telegram didn't ask them to attack. Thus, the 6th young master probably meant the same thing. Thus, they watched as the Siamese army left. Of course, there was an even more important reason. Defending Wanxiang City was a mission in the first place, and it was enough as long as he could complete this mission. What he had was only a standing army, and not an invincible main force. 5 miles away from the city, the Siamese military camps set off. Fan Yuhai and his 5,000 cavalrymen had already gathered at a spot and were watching the scene unfold with indifference. If one took a closer look, they would realize that they had already prepared everything. Once something unexpected happened, not only would they not cover the retreat, but they would also rush out at the first moment and escape without a trace. That was the truth. Fan Yuhai might have said that he would bring up the rear, but once Wanxiang City's city gates opened, he would definitely be the first to escape with the cavalry. After all, they were faster on horseback than the foot soldiers. Fan Yuhai's nerves were stretched taut. When the sky turned dark, all the Siamese army had retreated. However, there was still no movement from Wanxiang City. This made Fan Yuhai heave a sigh of relief. All right, now that everything is fine, we should leave. Fan Yuhai seemed to be talking to himself. Then he scanned his surroundings for a moment. He knew that after leaving this time, he didn't know when he would return. Perhaps he would never return. The Siamese army left Wanxiang City in a long line. Close to 100,000 soldiers formed a formation that spanned more than 10 miles. When the sky turned dark, they lit up their torches. From afar, it was even more spectacular. On the way back to Wulong, the mercenaries led by Lung Song had already set up an ambush in the dense forest on both sides of the road. Everyone had a good night's sleep during the day. Now, everyone was full of energy. They held onto their steel spears and stared at the retreating Siamese army with sparkling eyes. Gordon was quite capable. Although they were retreating, they didn't panic. The 1,000-man teams were well coordinated and didn't have any obvious weaknesses. Once one of the 1,000-man teams was attacked, the other 1,000-man teams would be able to provide support immediately. With the front and rear looking after each other, they would be able to minimize the losses. An ordinary army would be helpless against such a formation. However, it was a pity that they were facing a mercenary army. Furthermore, the mercenary army was prepared and had won the battle. Therefore, they were at a disadvantage in terms of morale and preparation. What was the purpose of ancient wars? Morale and preparation naturally played a very important role. Currently, the mercenaries had the advantage in these aspects. They had already won half the battle even before the battle started. Furthermore, night battles were their forte. It would be difficult for them to not win this battle. The only thing that mattered was how much they could achieve in this battle. Lung Song seemed to have known that the Siamese army would retreat in an orderly manner. As the commander, he had already come up with a countermeasure. That was to split up the troops. Didn't you have the front and rear looking after each other? Didn't you attack a location and the nearby troops would be able to provide support? What would you do if I suddenly attacked and dealt you a huge blow? Could you really have the front and rear looking after each other? Hence, in the dense forest by the road, the 8 auxiliary battalions were divided into companies. This resulted in 32 small units that were positioned at different locations for the ambush. The 3 cold vanguard battalions of the 1st Regiment became the mobile troops. They would provide support wherever the battle was intense. These 3 battalions were further divided into 36 platoons. They were positioned at the surrounding areas of the auxiliary troops. This was to ensure that nothing would go wrong. Just as the mercenary army was about to set up the ambush, the enemy finally appeared. According to the previous plan, the mercenary army did not attack immediately. Instead, they allowed the enemy's vanguard to pass by. Once the enemy's main force entered the area, it would be time for the mercenary army to attack. In the dense forest area, the most unbearable thing for people were the mosquitoes in the forest. Not only were there a lot of them, but they were also large and carried a weak poison. Once bitten, it wouldn't take long for a big blister to form, making it extremely itchy. In such an environment, ambushing and staying here for a long time was a test of one's willpower. Speaking of which, these mosquitoes would not consider whether or not they would bite you just because of your skin color or your intentions. As long as you had flesh and blood, even if you were a wild beast, you would be a delicious meal in their eyes. After ambushing here for more than 2 hours, all of the mercenaries' faces were covered with all kinds of large swollen bumps. If they had not worn gloves in advance, their hands would have been covered with bumps. This would have greatly affected their accuracy. Endure it, endure it. The same firm voice echoed in every mercenary's heart. The Cold Vanguard Battalion did not want to be looked down upon by the auxiliary troops. They had to endure it. Besides, they had undergone similar training countless times. Even though their faces were itchy, it was not that they could not endure it. It was just that it was a test of willpower. The auxiliary troops were also enduring it. They wanted to perform better so that they could join the Cold Vanguard Battalion. Before the battle, Commander Lung Song had said that after this battle, those who performed well would have a chance to join the Cold Vanguard Battalion. Even the 6th young master had agreed to this. The political department was already prepared to vet them. This was a chance to join the Cold Vanguard Battalion. This was the wish of almost all the auxiliary troops. In order to achieve this goal, in order to return home in glory, in order to prove that they were the strongest young men, what was a mosquito bite? They just had to endure it and endure it. As mentioned earlier, mosquitoes would not target a single person. While the mercenaries were enduring the inhumane bites, the Siamese soldiers who were walking on the road beside the forest were also suffering from the same bites. The only difference was that the further one was from the forest, the lower the chance of being bitten. Oh, these damn mosquitoes, they bit me. It hurts, it's so itchy. Chapter 622. That's right. I've killed 3, but it's not enough. They keep coming at me. It's so annoying. After the soldier heard his companion's complaint, not only did he agree, but he also waved the torch in his hand from time to time, as if he wanted to use this action to drive away the annoying mosquitoes. You idiots, can't you stay away from the forest? The farther you are, the safer you will be, just like me. Another soldier said proudly. Everyone noticed that the soldier was about to leave the army and walk to the other side of the road. It was far enough from the forest, so it was naturally safer. That's right. You're smart. The other soldiers immediately agreed. Then, more and more people started to leave the forest and walk to the other side of the road. The Chiliarch naturally noticed this, but he did not say anything. He was also on the other side of the road. After all, the mosquitoes would not let him go just because he was a general. They were a very fair species. The general did not reprimand them. Some timid soldiers also moved to the left side of the road, trying their best to keep a distance from the forest. It was dangerous to do so. Some people had already raised the possibility that there might be mercenaries ambushing them in the forest at night. If there were, the closer they were to the forest, the safer they would be. Once they were attacked, the closer they were, the faster they could rush to the enemy. This would ensure their safety to the greatest extent. Now, the army was walking on the left side of the road. Although it was only a dozen meters away, if a fight broke out, the dozen meters would be an uncrossable trench. At first, this idea was very popular. However, as night fell and more mosquitoes began to appear, no one said it anymore. What kind of joke was this? They were standing on the main road and were already as far away from the forest as possible. There were still so many mosquitoes. If they stayed in the forest, wouldn't they become a lump of meat? Who could withstand such a test? At least, if the Siamese soldiers thought that they could not withstand it, they would naturally think that others could not withstand it. In this way, the so-called threat in the forest seemed to be non-existent. This also made the Siamese soldiers who were walking along the edge of the forest let down their guard. They only focused on driving away mosquitoes and hurrying on with their journey. In the dense forest, Lung Song was also suffering from mosquito bites. His face was already densely packed with small bumps, and these bumps were still expanding. However, if the other soldiers could endure it as the division commander, he had no reason not to persist. He gritted his teeth and endured it. Once there are too many mosquitoes, the repellent that the 6th young master had people make is useless. Lung Song sighed softly and stared fiercely at the enemies more than 200 meters away. He decided to kill as many enemies as he could to avenge the mosquito bites tonight. The hour hand of the watch was turning, and with this movement, the enemy's main force had finally entered the forest, and the vanguard of the rear army had also stepped in. After calculating the situation in his mind, Lung Song knew that the time to attack had come. As long as he opened fire, the smell of gunpowder would be able to drive away some of the mosquitoes, let alone during a battle. Who would think about mosquito bites? Lung Song took off a pair of black leather gloves, revealing his uninjured hands. He held a Type 95 pistol tightly, adjusted his breathing and prepared to shoot. He could even feel the mosquitoes staring at his hands, but he did not care. His eyes were indifferent, and his face was calm. He aimed the muzzle at a captain of the Siamese army. Then his finger gently pulled the trigger. A bullet flashed through the night like a meteor, leaving a dazzling red trail in the air. Bang! As the gunshot rang out, the enemy chiliarch fell to the ground. If one could look closely, one would see that the bullet had pierced through his head. His eyes were wide open, and he could not be more dead. This shot was the signal to launch a general attack, and what followed was the dense sound of gunfire. The sound of gunfire seemed to be everywhere. After a wave of attack, the Siamese army lost countless bodies, and their formation was in chaos. Without any defense, and with the torches in their hands, what were they if not live targets? It was not until the second wave of gunfire rang out, and countless Siamese soldiers were killed that the smarter generals came to their senses. They shouted and threw down their torches. One by one, the torches were thrown away or extinguished, and the surroundings were plunged into darkness. The gunfire was not as fierce as before, and only occasionally it could be heard under the moonlight. The power of the flintlock had caught the Siamese soldiers off guard, and it also destroyed their pride. Many of them lay on the ground and did not dare to move, as if they were afraid that they would attract the attention of the mercenaries and become the next live target. Gordon was also attacked, and several of his bodyguards were killed. Under the cover of the other bodyguards, he was pressed to the ground and avoided the danger of being shot. He was protected by his bodyguards, and even if he was discovered, there would be a human shield in front of him, and he would not die. However, this was not what Gordon wanted. At this moment, his face was pale, and he did not know if it was because of the pain of being pressed down by his bodyguards, or because he was angry. The siege of Wanxiang City had failed, followed by Wulong City. Now, they were ambushed by the mercenaries, and he did not know how many of his 100,000 soldiers would be lost. As the general leading the army, he felt extremely humiliated. If both sides were to fight fair and square, he would lose because his skills were not as good as his opponent, and there would be nothing to say. However, the mercenaries were simply playing tricks on him. They were either relying on the advantage of firearms, mines, or other weapons, or ambushing him. This made him feel powerless, as if he had punched cotton with all his might. Initially, he was still proud of his long snake formation, and even thought that it would be best if the mercenaries appeared. This way, he would be able to counterattack and win. However, after being ambushed, he realized how wishful his thinking was. He knew to disperse his army, but did the mercenaries not know? Now, it was not just one spot that was attacked, but the entire army. How was he going to break through? The surroundings were pitch black, and all the torches were extinguished. Regardless of whether they were attacked or not, all of the 1,000-men soldiers were lying on the ground. It was as if this was the only way to ensure their safety and survive. Bastard, counterattack. What's the use of extinguishing the torches? Are you waiting for death? Although he was in a sorry state, and in order to save his life, he had to block more than one bodyguard in front of him. However, this did not stop him from reprimanding others and sending them to their deaths. Pass down my order, counterattack. There can't be too many enemies. Otherwise, they wouldn't be hiding and would take advantage of the situation to charge over. Quick, counterattack. I'll kill anyone who doesn't counterattack. Gordon's yelling was heard in the darkness. His yelling was extremely clear in such a quiet atmosphere, and it made many Kiliarch's expressions turn ugly. If they attacked, they might die, but if they didn't attack, they would die too. Thinking that dying in battle would be considered a sacrifice for the country, and at least their families would be safe, some of the Kiliarchs had no choice but to yell at their subordinates. Everyone, stand up and charge forward. The enemy is in the dense forest. As long as we charge forward, they won't have any advantage in close combat. I'll kill anyone who doesn't charge. The Kiliarchs did not forget to say the last sentence. Previously, they were still cursing Gordon for bullying the weak, but now that they thought about it, wasn't it the same for them? After the generals gave their orders, the soldiers were the ones who suffered the most. They did not have the ability to bargain with the generals. Under the orders of the centurions and the supervision of the decharches and corporals, the soldiers at the lowest level were forced to stand up. Then, in groups, They began to approach the dense forest on the right side of the road. If it weren't for the fact that they were worried about being bitten by mosquitoes, they would be standing at the edge of the forest right now. Chapter 6:23. Get down! One of the generals shouted. Immediately, the charging Siamese soldiers fell to the ground obediently. Their movements were so fast that it was as if they had practiced this countless times. Poor General Gordon had just stood up under the protection of his bodyguards when gunshots rang out. Once again, he was mercilessly pressed to the ground. He could not help but chew on a piece of mud in his mouth, which made him angry and ashamed at the same time. The sound of gunfire continued. From time to time, figures would rush out of the forest. Then, grenades would fall on the heads of the Siamese soldiers who were close to the forest. Retreat! Retreat! Crawl backward! Following the explosions, more and more soldiers fell to the ground. Some Kiliarchs hurriedly gave out orders. Then, a shocking scene happened. On the main road, countless people were frantically retreating. With this speed, even if they were the members of Cold Vanguard, some of them would probably pass the test. This should be the effect of potential. When a person was faced with death, he could always explode with unimaginable speed. As the Siamese soldiers retreated to their original positions, the gunshots and grenade explosions gradually stopped. Silence reigned over the land once again. Being tricked once wasn't something to be afraid of. A horse could stumble. However, if he were to fall for the same trick again and suffer a loss, then he would be considered stupid and would not learn from his mistakes. Hence, after this, even when Gordon's roar came from the darkness again, none of the Kiliarchs moved. With the mentality that the law could not punish the majority, if no one moved, could it be that your brother, the great general, would kill all of us Kiliarchs? If he really did that, it would not be long before a mutiny broke out. After shouting so many times that his voice was almost hoarse, the army did not move at all. Gordon gave up shouting. Forget it, forget it. He would just wait like this. Once the sun rose and everyone could see their opponents clearly, it would be time for him to counterattack. He did not believe that he would lose again at that time. This scene was similar to when Shenbo dealt with the 100,000 soldiers of the Lansong Kingdom. They were also forced to lie on the ground to ensure their safety. The only difference was that the terrain this time was not good. Lung Song had limited manpower and could not capture the 100,000 soldiers again. Pass down the order. The auxiliary soldiers will retreat first. The cold front will be the last to retreat. After dawn, gather at Wanxiang City. Lung Song gave the order reluctantly. He thought that he could fight a good battle, but he was helpless against these cowards. After all, he couldn't let the army charge forward. Firstly, their line of sight would be obstructed, and secondly, their forces were too few. If they really charged forward and engaged in close combat, they would be the ones to suffer. This was an outcome that he absolutely did not want. The mercenaries began to retreat into the depths of the forest in an orderly manner. Then, they turned and headed towards Wanxiang City. The Siamese soldiers on the road did not dare to guess or test the waters. This was because it would mean sacrificing countless lives. No one wanted to die, so they might as well stay where they were. The cold wind blew past them from time to time. Mosquitoes would also take the opportunity to bite them. The Siamese soldiers could only endure and curse in their hearts. They cursed the mercenaries for targeting them. They cursed their general for being useless. What kind of war was this? Time passed slowly and the sky gradually brightened. The dew fell and the mosquitoes were also affected by it. They began to leave one by one. When the white fog dissipated, the Siamese soldiers finally launched their counterattack. They rushed into the forest as if they wanted to perform well. However, what awaited them was no one. Even the cold front, who were the last to retreat, had all retreated an hour ago. Under the protection of his bodyguards, Gordon stood up straight again. However, his eyes were red, indicating that he did not rest well last night. General, the enemy is no longer in the forest. What should we do next? All of the major commanders and Kiliarchs began to gather around this general before asking questions with fawning expressions on their faces. After all, They had shown their fearful side last night. Now, they were afraid that their general would settle the score with them. Gordon wanted to settle the score with them. However, if he really dealt with these generals, who would lead the army? If these generals gathered together, they might even turn against him. He could only remember this incident in his heart. He waved his hand and said impatiently, "What else can we do? Continue to retreat. Let the army speed up and rush to Wulong City for breakfast." He could not deal with these generals, but he could still do something. Punishing them for not eating breakfast was a temporary way to vent his anger. Of course, this was also because Gordon wanted to rush back to the city as soon as possible. Once he entered the city, he would be much safer. After this battle, the Siamese army lost another 10,000 soldiers. With less than 90,000 soldiers and 10,000 injured soldiers, the Siamese army finally returned to Wulong City in the evening of the next day. When he entered the city, he saw the destroyed streets and houses. There were even some fireworks that had not been completely extinguished. Gordon knew that this base was finished. It would take at least a few months to rebuild it. This meant that the plan to attack Wanxiang City would have to be abandoned halfway. He would have to return to the capital with shame. Lung Song naturally did not care about what Gordon was thinking. 2 battles, 2 victories. More than 4,000 soldiers wiped out tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. Most importantly, he did not suffer any losses. This result was satisfactory. With a face full of excitement, he arrived at Wanxiang City. Wan Shaochen had already received the news and was waiting for these heroes with a group of people. What was different from when Gudan entered Wulong City was that good wine and tea had already been prepared. Everyone had a joyful expression on their faces. Wanxiang City was safe. As the governor, Wan Shaochen was naturally the happiest person. Although he was not afraid of war, he knew that once a battle broke out, the order in the city that had just gotten back on track would be destroyed. He did not know how much he would have to pay to get back on track. Fortunately, the 6th young master had calculated everything. The retreat of the Siamese army was a reality. With the 4,000 soldiers led by Lung Song, even if the enemy attacked again, they would not have to be afraid. With the advantage of weapons, Gordon would definitely return empty-handed. After Lung Song's troops returned to the city, another piece of good news was sent over via telegram. Just yesterday, the Awol dynasty also sent out 50,000 soldiers. However, they were quickly met by the Vietnamese mercenaries Hong Jin and Ruan Jianqing's 20,000 men at the strategic town of Pangang Valley in the northwest of Laos. There was no chance for the Awa dynasty to launch a surprise attack, so they happily withdrew their troops. Just like that, Siam and Awa's attacks were disrupted. The people of Laos finally did not have to live in fear anymore. They could continue doing what they were supposed to do. When the news of Laos reached Yang Chendong's ears, the 6th young master at Suing City heaved a sigh of relief. Although all of this was within his expectations, no one could guarantee that there would be no accidents. Now that the dust had settled, he could finally relax and focus all his attention on Suing City. They still haven't sent anyone to negotiate with us? Yang Chendong placed his hands on his waist and stood in front of the temporary headquarters. He looked at the tall city in the distance and asked Tiger's Mane, "Young master, not yet? There's news from the security bureau. Leader Yun is still in the middle of an operation. He should be here soon." Tiger's Mane reported, "Good, since that's the case, we'll increase the price. Some people just don't learn from their mistakes. Give the order, fire with all your might. I want to see how long they can hold on." Yang Chendong's eyes flashed. Due to his own foundation, he did not have the intention to take down the Phnom Penh dynasty this time. The 4.5 million Han people in Suing City were in the process of being transformed, but the news was not ideal. These people were all refugees that the southern Ming dynasty had to abandon. They were uneducated and were born to hard labor. They were also timid, and all they wanted was to have a bite to eat and survive. For such people to change in a short period of time, to give them confidence and dignity, it was not something that could be done in a day. Although the political department and the publicity department had put in a lot of effort, it was impossible to use it without a year. In addition, they had to learn culture, at least to be able to read, which may take longer. When the two provinces of Vietnam and Laos were established, 200,000 educated youths in Suwing City had been used. To take over the entire Phnom Penh dynasty, at least 100,000 educated youths were needed. This reserve was gone, and it would take time to train them again. This was Yang Chendong's difficulty. Without enough foundation, how could he build high-rise buildings? In the end, he decided that this time, he would only fight against the Phnom Penh dynasty. He wanted to show his muscles through this incident to ensure that no one would bully him in Vietnam or Laos when he was not here. The main reason that forced Yang Chendong to make this decision was not only the lack of educated youths, but also the emergence of an unexpected event. The honeymoon period between Baiming and Walla suddenly ended. The Security Bureau sent news that a war seemed inevitable. The reason turned out to be that Shi Biao, who was in charge of the security of the trade, blackmailed Walla merchants. The close relationship between the two sides suddenly became like fire and water. Chapter 624. Shi Biao was Baiming's Marquis Wu Qingho and also the nephew of General Shi Heng. Naturally, his uncle Shi Heng would take responsibility for the trouble he caused. No one knew how it ended up in such a situation where the two sides were about to go to war. Once Baiming was about to go to war with Walla, Yang Chendong had to pay attention to it. He had too many concerns there. He had decided to take a look at the grassland in the north after dealing with the matters in the south. There was a vast land with many strong horses. He wanted to organize an army of cavalry, just like Genghis Khan, to sweep across the Eurasian continent and conquer the world. Before that, the matter of the Golden Bien dynasty must be solved. However, to Yang Chendong's surprise, he did not intend to swallow the other party, but the other party did not intend to negotiate either. Since that was the case, there was no need to be polite. He would just bombard them with artillery fire. This was also a unique way of pressuring them. Yang Chendong ordered, and the 100mm mortar was put to use again. Shells were fired at Suwing City on the opposite side. With each shell falling, countless buildings were destroyed, and countless soldiers and civilians were killed. This was not the first time that the artillery was fired at the city. The powerful destructive power had caused the people in the city to begin a mass migration. After all, no one knew whether the next shell would fall on their heads. Especially Yang Chendong's order was the kind of random bombardment without a set target. Even General De N in the city did not know where the next shell would fall. This made him tremble in fear every day, and he did not feel safe at all even if he changed places to sleep every day. All he could do was to keep urging people to return to the country and ask His Majesty to agree to the peace talks. After all, this feeling of living in the shadow of death every day was not good. Golden Bien City, where the capital of the Golden Bien dynasty was located. The top officials of the dynasty had been discussing how to deal with the aggressive mercenaries for a few days, but there was still no consensus. The ministers were divided into two factions. One faction was in favor of war, while the other was in favor of war. Overall, the pro-war faction still had a certain advantage. They had already received news that both Siam and Awad had sent troops to Laos. Once they received good news, the mercenaries would definitely retreat. At that time, it would be time for the pro-war faction to strike and reclaim their lost territory. When King Boromir saw this, he did not respond to the mercenaries' attempt to negotiate. He wanted to be the first king to defeat the mercenaries. However, he was destined to be disappointed. Both the Siamese and Ava armies had retreated. It was only because of the lack of transportation that the news did not reach his ears. The residence of the right Prime Minister of Golden Rim City was located in a very prosperous area of the city. Two 2-meter-high stone lions stood in front of the gate day and night, showing the noble status of the owner of the house. In fact, in the Golden Bien dynasty, the right Prime Minister Dun did have a lot of power, second only to the king. He was on par with the left Prime Minister Ding Ding Wei. Perhaps to deal with the rumors of discord between the two, or perhaps because King Palomo did not wish to see his subjects too united and thus threaten his own position, the two ministers had been arguing over various issues all this while. Sometimes, the left minister would win, and sometimes, the right minister would win. This time, facing the issue of whether to fight or to negotiate with the mercenaries, the two prime ministers had different opinions. The left prime minister Ding Ding Wei was in favor of war, while the right prime minister Dun was in favor of peace. Under the leadership of the two of them, the court officials were naturally divided into two factions and followed their lead. Because the king had certain expectations for Siam and Ava, the current situation was that the left prime minister had a slight advantage, while the right prime minister was slightly passive. Today, after the court, the right prime minister Dun returned to his residence with an unhappy face. He went straight to the backyard. As if it had become a habit, Yunk liked to go to the backyard of some important ministers. It seemed to be safer there. This time, he was staying in the backyard of the right prime minister's residence. Du-en arrived with a displeased expression. When he saw Skylark's seat resting on a recliner with his eyes closed, he couldn't help but complain even before he walked over. "Sir Yun, I can really sleep. Don't you know that we're about to send troops to Suwon City?" "Send troops?" Yunk, who was lying on the recliner, slowly opened his eyes. Yes, the left Prime Minister Ding Ding Wei is leading more and more officials to suggest sending troops. I can't stop it. I think you should leave Golden Bien City quickly. Du Che seemed to like to see Yunk's surprised look. From the moment this person appeared until now, he had been acting as if nothing had happened, which made him feel very displeased. No matter what, he was still the right minister of the country, with a high position and power. Yet, just because he had accepted 200,000 taels of silver from the other party, he had not only detained the other party at home, but he was also running around in the imperial court for the other party. Now that the situation was becoming more and more unfavorable, he had already decided to stop. As for the 200,000 taels of silver he received before, he had spent a lot of effort on this trip. Didn't he need to be compensated? Yunk blinked his eyes, then leaned his head back and began to rest again. Dun, who had turned his head and said this, was still waiting to see Yunk's panicked look. The other party might even beg him. If he was happy, it would not be a problem to accept some money from the other party to ensure his safety. If he was unhappy, then he would just wave his hand and drive him away. What a joke. Do you really think that mercenaries are the best in the world? Why don't you look at the situation outside? The mercenaries have become an existence that everyone wants to beat up. He turned his head to the side and waited for a few breaths of time, but there was no movement at all. Out of curiosity, he turned around to take a look and saw Yun Kei lying down with a satisfied and comfortable look on his face. He immediately became angry. "Mr. Yun, didn't you hear what I said just now? I'll tell you." Without waiting for him to explain the seriousness of the matter, a piece of white paper with words written on it appeared in front of him. The other end of the paper was gently held by Yunk. What is this?" His face was filled with doubt. Could this be the banknote that the other party gave him to save his life? But it didn't seem like it. With curiosity in his heart, Dun still reached out to take it. He wanted to see what the other party was up to. If he still dared to play tricks with him, then he would definitely let the other party know that he, the Horse Lord, also had 3 eyes. He took the paper and found that it was indeed not a banknote. There were only a few lines of words written on it. Out of instinct, he looked at the words one by one. Along with it, his originally condescending and arrogant expression also changed. After reading it for the first time, his arrogant expression had already disappeared. After reading it for the second time, cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. After reading it for the third time, the way he looked at Yunk had completely changed. Previously, it was a condescending look, but now, it was filled with great shock and even a hint of flattery. Mr. Yunk, where did this come from? Are you joking?" Slowly opening his eyes, Skylark chuckled. "Joking? Do you think I would joke about this with the right Prime Minister? Let me tell you, this is the battle report I just received. It's 100% accurate. How about it? You should know what will happen next, right?" At this time, Yunk was very certain and was full of confidence. People said that a weak country had no diplomacy. And diplomacy could be divided into several types. For example, Their infiltration work was also a diplomatic method. Yang was very capable, but first he still needed a platform. A platform that could give him a chance to perform. The mercenaries were getting stronger step by step, and winning every battle was a platform for him to perform. It was with this guarantee that he could carry out his work like a fish in water. He could use all his methods and perform wonderful infiltration battles. This time, the mercenaries did not let him down. When everyone thought that they would suffer heavy losses and even lose their status, who would have thought that under the command and planning of the sixth young master, the scales of victory would lean towards him again? Yang was still lying there, and he didn't even have the intention to get up. But now, Dun didn't mean to blame him, or he couldn't care less about it. He was standing there and constantly wiping his cold sweat, thinking about the situation that the Gilded Dynasty would face next. What was written on the paper was the situation at the front line. It was sent to Skylark by wireless telegram. It clearly recorded the defeat of the Siamese army and the failure of the Awa army. They had no choice but to retreat. What was written on it was what the Gilded Dynasty relied on before. If what was written on it was true, then the Gilded Dynasty would have no reinforcements, and the whole country would be in danger. As the right prime minister of a country, Dun naturally knew what this meant. In the worst-case scenario, the mercenaries would be like beasts coming out of the mountains. They could open their bloody mouths and bite the Gilded Dynasty at will. If they wanted to, it was not impossible for them to bite the Gilded Dynasty to death. Thinking of such a result, and thinking that His Majesty wanted to continue to send more troops to Suwang City, wasn't that tantamount to angering the mercenaries? At that time, there would be no need for peace talks. They would just fight until one side was crippled. But no matter how he looked at it, it seemed that only the Gilded Dynasty would be crippled. Dun's face changed again and again. At this moment, his mind was spinning rapidly. He slowly came up with an idea. That was to take the initiative to ask for peace before the other side sent out troops. A slap would never hit a smiling face. As long as their posture was humble, it was still possible to negotiate successfully. After all, the army of the Golden Dynasty had not been completely damaged. They still had the power to fight back. Once the other two allies saw that they were resisting desperately, they might send troops for the second time. Chapter 625. The opportunity was right in front of him. Duan, who had made up his mind, no longer had that mocking expression on his face. Instead, he put on a flattering smile and took half a step forward. Sir Yun, can you open your eyes and tell this Prime Minister what the Duke of Loyalty and Courage has in mind? After all, we are now neighboring countries. It's better not to hurt our relationship. Dun took the initiative to lower his head. Yang was not surprised by this. If there were still people who wanted to start a war with the mercenaries after receiving this information, they would either have already given up on life and death, or they would have other ideas. He could not help but sigh in his heart. The sixth young master also sent a telegram, saying that they could agree to the peace talks, but they had to try their best to obtain benefits. This time, Yang Chendong did not act like he did with the Jiaoji and Lansong kingdoms. He did not send troops to destroy the kingdoms. In the end, it was not that he had become merciful, or that his ambition had been satisfied. On the contrary, everything was done for the sake of the overall situation. Without enough resources and manpower, even if they sent troops to destroy the Phnom Penh dynasty, they would only be picking up a mess. Not to mention, if they really fought, the price they would have to pay would be too high. No one could guarantee that Siam and Ava would not send reinforcements again. The mercenaries did not want to face such a situation before they were fully prepared. With the idea of mutual destruction, no one knew what kind of power these two kingdoms would erupt in the face of a life-and-death crisis. Once their armies really entered the Vietnamese and Laos provinces, the losses would be immeasurable. Without sufficient preparation, Yang Chendong did not want to face this situation. Because of this, Yang still had a lot of work to do. Otherwise, he would have already laid his cards on the table with Duane. It was either death or surrender, and he would have just made a decision. After sighing in his heart, Skylark finally stood up from the reclining chair and stood in front of Duane. Right, Prime Minister, This time it was you who provoked the mercenaries first, and then we sent out our troops. Even if we were to send out our troops, we would inform you beforehand that you would have to give us a definite answer after the emissary returned to Wanxiang City. And it's precisely because of your arrogance and rudeness that we're meeting on the battlefield, isn't it? Du Si lowered her head like a child who had done something wrong and nodded repeatedly. Some people said that this time, it was the mercenaries who started the war without declaring war, but that was not the case. Everything was just as Young had said. The emissary from Laos had given them a chance, but no one had taken it seriously at that time. That was why Shangding City was suddenly breached and Jujing City's 100,000 soldiers were defeated. Alright, since Right Chief Minister has already admitted that it was your fault this time, then whether my mercenary army will fight or shake hands with you will depend on your performance and what you are willing to pay. In short, this time, don't take my words seriously. Otherwise, you won't be able to buy medicine for regret anywhere. Alright, I'll wait for you here. You can also go and verify the authenticity of the information. In fact, there's no need to verify it. Your scouts should be able to send the news back in 2 days. But if you haven't made a decision by then, my mercenary army will take the initiative to make the decision for you. No. Du En kept shaking his head. Previously, because he had placed his hopes on the allies of the two countries, he wanted to send troops to the front line to pressure the mercenaries. Since he knew that his allies had been defeated or had retreated, it was very clear what to do. Du En's attitude was arrogant and even a little arrogant. But when he left, he bowed with every step, like a child seeking advice from a teacher. He was extremely respectful. After finally leaving the backyard, Du En's expression returned to its serious state. Men, prepare a sedan. I want to enter the palace to see His Majesty. It was not that Du En didn't doubt the authenticity of the information provided by Yunk. But Yunk had already made it clear that he would not wander around and would wait here, and the news would be confirmed in 2 days. Did this person eat a bear's heart and leopard's guts to joke about such a matter? If everything was true, then it was necessary for him to report the situation to the king. It was better to be prepared than to not know anything at all. In the king's palace, Du En stood in the side hall. Opposite him sat King Boromir. Boromir was a little fat, and he was wearing a golden royal robe. He narrowed his eyes. Right, Prime Minister, I have thought about it. The left Prime Minister's words are not unreasonable. Since Siam and Ava have already sent news, they will definitely send troops. As allies, we should also send more troops to the front line to pressure the mercenaries. Boromir was very clear about the reason why Du En wanted to see him. In the morning, the two prime ministers had been arguing in the court. In the end, Du En's faction became weaker, and even he, the king, leaned towards Ding Dingwei's opinion and continued to send reinforcements. Boromir did not understand why Du En wanted to see him. Could it be that he wanted to continue persuading him? Your Majesty, this is the information I received. Please take a look. Du En did not explain anything. He only presented the information he received from Yunk. He believed that once the king saw this, his attitude would change drastically. You just received this information? Boromir looked at Du En with a puzzled gaze. The right prime minister did not have the authority to gather information, so where did he get this information from? Puzzled, Boromir took the paper with the words written on it from the eunuch beside him. After looking at it casually, his eyes widened and his body began to tremble. In the end, even his hands that were holding the paper were trembling. Right Prime Minister, where did you get this information? Why didn't I know about it? Boromir suddenly raised his head and looked at Du En with a terrifying gaze. Your Majesty, this information was sent to my residence by a merchant who claimed to be from Laos. I only saw it when I returned to my residence. Du En naturally would not reveal that Yunk was in his residence. Who knew if the king would accuse him of colluding with the enemy in a fit of anger? Besides, he was counting on his relationship with Yunk to gain more benefits in the future. He had to hide this person well. A merchant from Laos? Boromir was not very satisfied with this answer. He wanted to ask why such a merchant did not look for him or any other officials, but the right prime minister. But before Boromir could ask, Duan took the initiative to explain, "Your Majesty, my butler said that the Laos merchant will come looking for me again. But in my opinion, this is not important. What is important is whether the information is true or not. If it is, what should we do next?" Right, according to the right Prime Minister, is this news true? Boromir seemed to have woken up the person in his dream. Boromir's voice carried a hint of urgency as he asked. In fact, it did not matter how the information came about. The most important thing was whether it was true or not. If it's true, it's a big mistake to send troops to the front. What's wrong? The other two allies have retreated. Do you want to fight head-on with the mercenaries with the Golden Border Dynasty's powerful army? In my opinion, regardless of whether it is true or not, there is no smoke without fire. We have to prepare for a backup plan. Duan raised his head. He wanted to say that since he was the one who sent the information, of course, he would believe it to be true. But he would not say that. He wanted the king to figure it out himself. At the same time, he wanted to use this as an excuse to trick some people, so he could not be too sure. Yes, it is necessary to prepare for a backup plan. Boromir kept nodding, but soon he shook his head. But we have to be careful. Someone might be deliberately spreading false information to mislead us. So, summon the left Prime Minister to the palace for a meeting. In the end, Boromir did not make a decision. He wanted to summon the others to listen to their opinions. When he heard that the king wanted to summon the left Prime Minister, Duan's eyes flashed with excitement. He knew the king too well. The king liked to listen to everyone's opinions, as if that was the best way to make the right choice. But he had forgotten that the truth was often in the hands of only a few people. The king summoned the left Prime Minister, Ding Ding Wei, in his official robe, appeared in the side hall. Ding Ding Wei was tall and slender. He looked to be in his 50s. His eyes were not big, but they were very spirited and gave people a feeling of wisdom. "Your subject greets your majesty." When he entered the side hall, Ding Ding Wei bowed to the king according to the rules. "Left Prime Minister, please rise. Come, bring this over." When Ding Ding Wei entered the hall, Boromir's expression had already returned to normal. He looked calm and relaxed. Obviously, he wanted to see the debate between the two prime ministers before making a decision. With the demeanor of a prime minister, Ding Ding Wei unhurriedly took the paper that the eunuch presented to him. First, he gave it a cursory glance. His eyes immediately widened. Then he carefully read it twice. After that, he did not immediately speak. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes as if he was thinking about something. King Boromir was not in a hurry. He seemed to be used to the left prime minister's way of doing things. He sat there calmly and did not say anything. On the other side, Duan was also not in a hurry. This was a trap to begin with. He had even thought about what choice Ding Ding Wei would make. He was just waiting for him to jump in. After about 5 or 6 breaths, Ding Ding Wei finally opened his eyes. He cupped his fists and said to Boromir, "Your Majesty, may I know where this information came from?" Chapter 626. For the left Prime Minister to say this, it was clear that he did not believe that this was news from the army. He knew very well that regarding the movements of the other two countries, it would take at least the day after tomorrow for definite news to arrive. Now that it had arrived, it could only mean that this news did not come from official channels. The left Prime Minister is indeed amazing. This news didn't come from the military. It was sent by the right Prime Minister. Boromir seemed to be very satisfied with the left Prime Minister's performance and didn't forget to praise him. The right Prime Minister sent it? Ding Ding Wei laughed. Originally, he was suspicious of this news because they were enemies with the mercenaries. Of course, he had done his research on the strength of the mercenaries. In his opinion, although the mercenaries were powerful, their weakness was also very obvious. They were too few in number. They might be able to deal with any one country, but if it was 1 against 3, they wouldn't be able to do it. But now, the news said that the armies of Siam and Ava had sent out their troops and were defeated. It seemed too unreal. This was already suspicious. Now that he knew that the news came from the right Prime Minister, Ding Dingwei instinctively thought that it was fake news. As for why this news came, it was very simple. It was because Dun wanted to prevent him from sending reinforcements to the front line. Because the two of them had different political views, once the reinforcements were sent, it meant that the other side had lost the battle. Oh, why is the left prime minister laughing? No one knew what Borimov was thinking when he said this. But from his words, it was clear that he was a person who wasn't afraid of things getting out of hand. Your Majesty, please forgive me for being rude. Now, I would like to ask the right prime minister a few questions. Is that all right? Ding Dingwei still smiled and asked Borimov for permission. I believe the right prime minister won't mind, right? Borimov nodded with a smile. This was equivalent to agreeing on behalf of Dun. Of course. The confident Dun nodded reservedly. Then he looked at Ding Dingwei and said, if the left prime minister has any questions, feel free to ask. I will answer truthfully. At this moment, Dun's expression was very calm. There was even a hint of confidence on his face. When Ding Dingwei saw all of this, for some reason, his heart couldn't help but tremble. As an old rival, he knew all too well what kind of person Dun was. For the sake of fighting for power and profit, they would do anything. Such people were often willing to turn black into white. They could be said to have mastered the art of thick black. Because of this person had done too many things that made people feel guilty. It was difficult to describe him as confident. But now, he was actually so calm. Could it be that the information was true? As soon as this idea flashed through his mind, it was quickly rejected by Ding Dingwei himself. If it was true, His Majesty would not have summoned him. Since His Majesty had called him here, it could only mean one thing. Even His Majesty was skeptical about this information. Once he and His Majesty both approved of this information, the matter of sending more troops to the front lines would be delayed indefinitely. This meant that the other party had won this battle, which also meant that the other party was stronger than him. When he thought of this, Ding Dingwei threw the suspicion that had just arisen to the back of his mind. Right, Prime Minister, may I ask where did you get this information? To be honest, left Prime Minister, this information was sent to my residence by a merchant who claimed to be from Laos. Dun, who was already prepared, replied calmly. Laos merchant? I wonder if right Prime Minister has seen him with your own eyes? When he heard that the source of the information was so childish, Ding Dingwei was even more certain of his guess. This must be a smokescreen thrown out by Dun in order to win the battle of whether or not to send troops. Since he knew what was going on, he definitely couldn't let the other party succeed. Dun answered very straightforwardly. But he didn't forget to add, although I haven't seen him, I still believe this information. So according to my opinion, whether or not to send troops to Suwing City needs to be carefully considered. This answer finally made Ding Dingwei unable to hold back his laughter. If it wasn't for the following explanation, perhaps he wouldn't be so certain. But since he took the initiative to mention the issue of sending troops, it was tantamount to revealing 300 taels of silver here. After being the left prime minister for so many years, Ding Dingwei believed that his ability to observe people's expressions had reached a very high level. Dun's words were tantamount to confirming his previous guess. Since he had already made his decision, Ding Dingwei didn't look at Dun anymore. Instead, he turned to Borimov and cupped his fists. Your Majesty, in my opinion, this information can't be trusted. It's completely groundless. So I ask Your Majesty to make a decision and allow us to send reinforcements to Suwing City. When the time is right, we will go all out to counterattack and recover the lost land. This will raise the prestige of our country, as well as the prestige of our king. Ding Dingwei finally made his move. Dun, who had been waiting impatiently, also turned to Borimov and cupped his fists. Your Majesty, I believe this information is true. It's the same as my previous guess. So I'm sure Your Majesty will be cautious in sending troops. I can even guarantee with my official position that if this information isn't true, I'm willing to resign in 2 days and retire to my hometown. At this moment, Borimov and Ding Dingwei were shocked by Dun's words. This was a scene that they hadn't expected at all. Originally, after hearing Ding Dingwei's words, Boromov could basically confirm that this was a fake information that Du En had deliberately created to delay the sending of reinforcements. He was still a little angry about this. He could allow the two prime ministers to fight each other, but the prerequisite was that they couldn't disrupt the development of the country. Otherwise, he wouldn't hesitate to chop off their heads. But suddenly, Du En was so confident that he would use his authority as a stake. At this moment, Boromov hesitated. Boromov wasn't the only one who thought so. Left Prime Minister Ding Dingwei was also caught off guard by Du En's move. What's going on? It's just a plan to delay the arrival of reinforcements. Why did he make such a huge bet? Why did the right Prime Minister dare to make such a huge bet? What did he rely on? Ding Dingwei looked at Dun seriously, but he couldn't see anything from Dun's face. Especially at this moment, Dun intentionally closed his eyes. This made Ding Dingwei feel that he didn't know where to start and analyze. The side hall fell silent. Both the king and the left prime minister were shocked by Du En's bold words. They couldn't help but wonder if they were wrong. Du En opened his eyes and said, "If this information is true, not only should we stop sending reinforcements, but we should also find a way to negotiate with the mercenaries. The sooner we negotiate, the more sincere we will be and the less we will have to pay. On the other hand, when the situation is settled, we will have to pay several times the price if we want to negotiate with them." Du En's words couldn't be more apt to describe him now. Du En's words were completely for the sake of the Golden Border dynasty and had nothing to do with any power struggle. King Boromir was indeed frightened by Du En's boldness. He couldn't help but hesitate. But before he could say anything, left Prime Minister Ding Dingwei also opened his mouth and said in the same shocking tone, "I think this news is fake. Although the mercenaries are powerful, their military strength is limited. It is impossible for them to stop the armies of Siam and Ava at the same time. This is the right time to send reinforcements. I am also willing to guarantee that if I am wrong, I will retire and return to my hometown." Well, Tintinwei had also put in a lot of effort. His words were so certain that Boromir was in a dilemma. Normally, such a thing wouldn't happen. The word official was always there. Real officials, especially important ministers, spoke with a sense of propriety. Even if they were more than 90% sure, they wouldn't be so certain. They would always leave a way out for themselves, right? But today, the two prime ministers had put their official positions on the line and their opinions were so different. This was so abnormal that it made Boromir even more hesitant. On the other hand, Du En was first surprised, then he was overjoyed. Someone had finally jumped into the pit. It was his old rival. He really wanted to shout out loud to vent his excitement. He was so excited in his heart, but on the surface, Du En still suppressed his excitement, cupped his fists and said to Ding Dingwei, "Good, Lord Left Prime Minister, if that's the case, we might as well make a bet. We will see the result in 2 days. But I still have one thing to say. If we want to negotiate with the mercenaries then, we will have to pay a higher price. Let's make a bet. But I still support sending reinforcements. If we send reinforcements too late, we can't afford to suffer any losses at the front line," Ding Dingwei said firmly. Then he stopped looking at Du En and focused all his attention on King Boromir. Obviously, he was listening to the king's orders. The two prime ministers had put their official positions on the line and spoke with great confidence. This way, Boromir was the one who had a headache. This was different from what he had expected. He wanted to see which side was right and support. But now that both sides were so strong, how could he make a decision? Boromir wanted to put his hands into his hair to calm down, but he knew that if he did so, it would be very unbecoming of him as a king. But in front of the two prime ministers, he had to give an explanation. After thinking about it, he decided to continue mediating. If he couldn't make the decision, then he would let the facts make the decision. All right, since the two prime ministers are so confident in their negotiations, why don't we all calm down and wait for a while? There should be news in 2 days. At that time, this king will know how to make a decision. Chapter 627. The king actually chose to wait, causing Ding Dingwei's expression to change. "Your Majesty, you can't do that. This is exactly what some people are trying to do. If there are no reinforcements coming from the front, it will be a big problem. Your Majesty, what we should do now isn't to send reinforcements. Instead, we should immediately send a peace envoy to contact the mercenaries. This is the only way to resolve this matter with the smallest price. A long delay may lead to trouble. Du En also called out. He looked very anxious, but only he knew how happy he was. He had already dug a hole for Ding Ding Wei. Now he just had to wait 2 days to see the results. As for whether the king would agree to the peace talks now, he wasn't the one who would suffer a loss. Since the king wasn't anxious, why should he be anxious? The two prime ministers seemed to have the intention to quarrel again. Boromir immediately felt a headache coming on. He couldn't help but say in a slightly angry tone, all right. It's just 2 days later. Nothing major will happen. This matter is settled. Don't say anything else. The king was angry. Whether it was Ding Ding Wei or Dun, they knew when to stop. They just glared at each other and left the palace after saluting. Not long after the two of them left, the whole story began to spread. First, some of the important ministers knew about this matter. Soon, the commoners on the streets were also very clear about it. King Boromir didn't say anything about it. He even knew that the two prime ministers must have deliberately spread the news in order to undermine each other. It was better for him to remain uninvolved in this matter. This way, he would be able to seize the initiative. Even the king was prepared to watch the show, and so were the officials and commoners. Soon, they formed two factions and began to have an intense discussion about who would win. The combat strength of the mercenaries naturally became the main topic of discussion. Those who supported Du En would naturally say that the mercenaries were powerful and that they were omnipotent. Those who supported Ding Ding Wei would naturally say that no matter how powerful the mercenaries were, they were too few in number. It was absolutely impossible for them to win a war against the three countries. Du En's words were just to delay the reinforcements to support the front line. It was just to tear down the left prime minister's platform. This kind of action that sacrificed the interests of the country for one's own personal reputation was really too despicable. If it could be proven that Du En was lying 2 days later, then he should be charged with the crime of harming the country. The people who supported both sides were still having an intense debate. There was no victory or defeat, but the mercenaries' reputation had already penetrated deep into the hearts of the commoners. This was especially true for the people who had escaped from Shangding City. Some of them had come to the capital, and through their mouths, they had described the mercenaries as incomparably terrifying. In the end, the mercenaries' reputation had been greatly increased. This was something that even Yunk had not expected. However, this was good news after all. Yunk quickly ordered his subordinates to spread all kinds of news about the mercenaries. For example, the commoners in Vietnam and Laos were living very well. With Yang Bao, once they obtained citizenship, they wouldn't be bullied anymore. If this news was spread during normal times, not only would it not be accepted, but it would also be criticized as a misconception. However, at this time, when the news was spread, not only did it attract a lot of attention, but it also attracted a lot of attention. The two sides were fighting, and for a while, there was no clear winner. Everyone was watching the show, but there were also people who were very depressed. For example, General Hun Senator Hun Sen was still very strong. After losing Jujing City and becoming the general of the defeated army, he was escorted back to Golden Rim City. It was said that he was going to be punished. At this moment, his greedy behavior saved him. Because he was greedy for money, he became the child of wealth. As long as he had some influence in the imperial court and could speak, he would send people to give generous gifts to the officials. As a result, there were many people who spoke up for him. In the end, the left and right prime ministers spoke up together. The left prime minister Ding Ding Wei thought that at this time, although Hun Sen had some small problems, he could still fight. Moreover, killing a general before the war was not good for the morale of the army, so he spoke up for him. The right prime minister Du En was much simpler. He had received enough money, so he naturally stood up and said a few good words. The two prime ministers had the same opinion, which was a very rare thing. In the end, King Boromir decided to give Hun Sen a chance to perform meritorious deeds. He even gave him military power and told him to be prepared to support Su Wang City at any time. But now, the two prime ministers had different opinions and couldn't decide who was better. Instead, Hun Sen stopped supporting Su Wang City. He had no choice but to wait at home. But in his heart, he was cursing Du En. If it wasn't for the right prime minister, he would have been at the front line by now and could even turn the situation around to prove his ability. No matter how the atmosphere in the king's city changed, time didn't stop flowing because of this. It was still moving forward on schedule. After tonight, it would be 2 days tomorrow. It was time for the Golden Rim Dynasty's fast horse scouts to return. The results would be revealed tomorrow. Dwayne became a little nervous. After all, he didn't get the news through his own channels, so after thinking about it, he went to the backyard to look for Skylark because he couldn't sleep. At this time, Yun Kei was not asleep. He seemed to have known that Du En would come. He set up a simple tea shed in the small courtyard and specially prepared an extra chair. Mr. Yun knew that I would come? As soon as Du En appeared here and saw the furnishings, he was shocked. Hee, we will see the results tomorrow. Right, Prime Minister, it is inevitable that you will be impatient. Come over and have a cup of tea to calm your mind. Yunk had a smile on his face as he casually pointed to the chair opposite him. Du En also wanted to hear Yun Kei say that there was no problem with the information, so he simply sat down. But just as he sat down, after hearing Yun Kei's next sentence, he suddenly jumped up. Yunk chuckled and said, "Actually, the previous news was just to tease Right Prime Minister. The mercenaries at the front line need time to take down Suwing City. They were afraid that you would send reinforcements and disrupt the plans of the Duke of Loyalty, so they made this plan." After hearing these words, Du En was frightened. He couldn't help but jump up. Then he angrily stared at Yun Kei, who was still sitting there and fiddling with the tea, and said, "Mr. Yun, don't make jokes at this time. Otherwise, people will die." This so-called death naturally meant that he would call the guards and servants of the mansion to kill Yun Kei in a fit of anger. Because if all of this was true, he would become a tool in the hands of others. He would lose face and delay the important matters of the country. If that was really the case, he would become a sinner of the Golden Border dynasty. Du En was really angry. He even had an impulse to kill someone. Yun Kei acted as if he didn't hear anything. After finishing the last procedure of making tea, he raised his head and looked at the angry Du En and said, "Right, Prime Minister, of course I was joking." Dwayne's expression changed when he heard this. He didn't even know which sentence was true and which was false. Right, Prime Minister, isn't what I said just now what you suspected in your heart?" Yun Kei once again pointed to the chair opposite him, indicating that he could sit down. Then he casually said, "I just said what Right Prime Minister was thinking. But this only represents what you think, not what I think. I still have the same words. The news is incomparably accurate. Otherwise, I wouldn't stay here and wait for the confrontation, right?" Yun Kei dared to stay in the mansion, which was already a clear proof. Unless he was playing a death game, otherwise, he wouldn't take such a risk. This sentence finally made Du En calm down a little. He sat down again. "Mr. Yun, is the news really true? You also know that the outside world is in chaos. If the news is not true, then this Prime Minister is really dead." "Of course it is true. I have already said this. Right, Prime Minister, have you thought about it? Once the news comes tomorrow that proves you are right, what should we do next?" Yun Kei was waiting for Du En's arrival, not to dispel the other party's worries, but to prepare for the next layout. Du En didn't know this. He was now thinking about the problem raised by Yun Quebec. He really didn't think about it. First, it was because he couldn't confirm the accuracy of the news. Second, he wanted to see Left Prime Minister Ding Dingwei make a fool of himself. As for other things, he didn't have time to think about it. But since Yun Kei asked this question, he must have thought about it. This time, Du En asked with an attitude of asking for advice. "May I ask Mr. Yun, what should this Prime Minister do next? You don't have to do anything. Just say that you are sick because you were suspected this time and go back to the mansion to stay. Let the Left Prime Minister and the others mess around outside. The higher they jump, the harder they will fall in the future. When the time is right, Right Prime Minister will stand up and shout. That will be the best time to prove your ability. The smile on Yun Kei's face disappeared, replaced by a face of determination and decisiveness. Duan was also a very smart person. He immediately thought of something and said, Mr. Yun means to first give up the right to negotiate, and when those people can't reach an agreement, this prime minister will help to decide the overall situation? Yun Kei nodded with satisfaction. He praised the other party for being a smart person. Duane chuckled after hearing Skylark's praise. But then he frowned and said, but if someone else completes the negotiation with the mercenaries, then wouldn't this prime minister have nothing to do with it? Chapter 628. They won't be able to negotiate. The Duke of Loyalty has already sent me a message. Unless the right prime minister personally comes, it's useless for anyone to negotiate. Skylark said this with an incomparably confident tone as he smiled and looked at Dun, who was sitting opposite him. Then I thank the Duke of Loyalty for your praise. Come, let me propose a toast to Mr. Yun. I wish us a happy cooperation. Dun laughed as his worries were swept away. However, he did not know that the reason Yang said so much to him and the reason why Yang Chendong wanted him to negotiate was because he wanted more benefits. As for what benefits he could get, he would know in the next few days. Dun left Yang's courtyard with satisfaction and went back to his room to sleep. When he opened his eyes again, the sky was already bright. While he was having breakfast, the butler suddenly came to report that the scouts he had sent to Ava and Siam had returned. They were now part of the royal palace. At the same time, they brought with them a huge piece of news, which was that the armies of the two countries had been defeated. They were mercilessly blocked outside the gates of Laos by the mercenaries, unable to enter at all. In other words, the information provided by Yunk was extremely accurate. This time, Dun had made the right bet. Listening to the information provided by the butler, Duane grinned widely. Everything was as Skylark had said. Now, he needed to rest according to the plan. Thus, he told the housekeeper, spread the news outside. Say that this prime minister has fallen ill due to mental exhaustion. It's not convenient for him to see any guests. The butler was puzzled. This time his master had won. Shouldn't it be time for him to shine in the court? Why did he have to stay at home and not come out? However, he was only a butler and could not understand his master's thoughts. After seeing the stern look in Dun's eyes, he immediately agreed and left to spread the news. At this time, the palace was already in a mess. The scouts had just returned and brought news from the front lines. The Ava and Siam armies' plan to surround Wei to rescue Zhao and attack Laos while it was empty had failed. Not only that, but the Siamese army had also suffered heavy losses. They had lost 3 rounds in a row, and their rations had been destroyed. As soon as Boromir heard the news, he knew that things were going south. Fortunately, he didn't send any reinforcements to the front lines, which meant that he didn't reveal his intention to fight to the death with the mercenaries. As such, there was still a chance for both sides to negotiate. Left Prime Minister Ding Dingwei stood there with his head lowered. There were many other officials standing in the hall. However, they all seemed to intentionally or unintentionally maintain a certain distance from him. It could be seen that this time, he had miscalculated and lost to Right Minister Duan. According to the previous agreement, he would have to give up the position of Prime Minister and retire. If that was the case, who would put a person without power and influence in their eyes? There was no need to talk about respect. As if sensing the questioning gazes of the crowd, Ding Dingwei clenched his teeth. He suddenly cupped his fists and bowed to Boromir. Your Majesty, this subject has lost. This subject will immediately resign as the left Prime Minister. 1 day later, this subject will pack up and leave the capital. What are you doing? Did this king allow you to leave? It was just a joke. How can you take it seriously? I don't think the right Prime Minister will take it seriously. Alright, why isn't the right Prime Minister here? Boromir was having a headache over the current situation, and Ding Dingwei's resignation came. In such a chaotic situation, how could he agree to it? Since Boromir was the one who said that, even if Dwayne was here, he wouldn't be able to say anything, let alone when he wasn't here. When Boromir asked this question, everyone noticed that the right prime minister wasn't in the hall. Many of the officials started whispering to each other. Some of them even thought that the right prime minister was using this opportunity to raise his own status. Just wait, he will definitely appear in a moment, and then he will stand here with the attitude of a victor and judge the world. More than one person had the same thought. Just as they thought that Dwayne was going to make a grand entrance, a eunuch quietly walked up to Boromir and whispered something into his ear. Is there such a thing? Is the right prime minister really ill? Boromir turned his head after hearing the eunuch's words and asked with a look of surprise. When he received the news from the scouts, he wanted to give Duin some praise or even substantial benefits. After all, this time, Duin didn't immediately send reinforcements. This was equivalent to creating a buffer zone with the mercenaries. It was equivalent to saving the Golden Border dynasty and not pushing them into a hopeless situation. But he didn't expect that at such a critical time, Duin would fall ill. This was too much of a coincidence. At least he didn't believe it. The eunuch we sent to bring him into the palace replied that the right prime minister's face was ugly. His whole body was trembling and he was lying in bed. It seems that he is really ill. But in order to find out the truth, we have sent the imperial physician to the right prime minister's residence. I think there will be news soon. The old eunuch replied respectfully. Good, inform this king as soon as there is news. Boromir nodded. This time, whether Duin was really ill or not, he wouldn't punish him. It was understandable. After all, wasn't it human nature for people to vent their grievances after being wronged? But this time, Boromir still underestimated Duin's determination. This was a person who could be ruthless to his enemies, but even more ruthless to himself. In order to make it seem like he was really sick, he actually asked the housekeeper to get some ice from the cellar. Then he turned it into ice water and poured it on his body. In this way, he really caught a cold. His whole body was cold and he fell ill. The scout's return had confirmed that what Yunk said was true. Since that was the case, what harm was there in trusting him again? He just hoped that the next development would be as Yunk said. Otherwise, it would be a waste to get sick this time. The imperial physician came and found that Duin had indeed caught a cold. The imperial physician immediately prescribed medicine and then returned to the palace to report. What? He is really ill? After the old eunuch said the news, King Boromir was shocked. It seemed that the right prime minister was really under a lot of pressure this time. Of course, this was just a passing thought. After ordering the old eunuch to send the imperial physician to see the right prime minister, he put his thoughts on the court. He didn't make a decision just now because he had been waiting for the right prime minister to come. Since he couldn't come, the matter of the peace talks could only be handed over to someone else. Although it was someone else, there weren't many people who could really choose. How powerful was the mercenary army? The position of the person sent to negotiate was too low. How could he talk to them on equal terms? Wouldn't it be shameful if the person sent couldn't even see the face of the king? After thinking about it, Boromir still chose the left prime minister, Ding Ding Wei. The left prime minister also wanted to use this opportunity to repay the king's kindness. Of course, he didn't hesitate to agree. After only 2 hours, Ding Ding Wei, who had made some preparations, left Golden Rim City and went straight to Suing City. The reason why he was in such a hurry was naturally because he knew that speed was the most important thing in war. Now that the two allies had lost the war, if the Golden Rim dynasty didn't make a move, who knew if the other side would gather all the troops to attack the Golden Rim dynasty in anger? Once they made this decision, it would be even more difficult to negotiate with them. The carriage sped along the way. Who knew how many horses were changed on the road? Normally, it would take 5 or 6 days to reach Suing City, but Ding Ding Wei only took 3 days. As soon as he arrived, he sent people to the mercenary camp outside the city to express the Golden Rim dynasty's intention to negotiate and stop the war. At this moment, Suing City was already full of holes. These days, the mercenary army's cannons didn't stop firing. It was unknown when a powerful shell would fall, and every time it fell, it would cause a lot of damage in the city. It was normal for people to die and houses to be destroyed. For this reason, most of the people in the city had been evacuated, leaving only the soldiers. They didn't dare to leave without orders. They were on tenterhooks every day, fearing that the next shell would fall on their heads. General De N personally came out to meet Ding Dingwei. As soon as they met, the general began to complain. He also said that he had made countless requests to the king's city, either to send reinforcements or to prepare for peace talks. Why didn't there a response until now, etc. Facing Den's aggrieved face, Ding Dingwei asked with a displeased face, "You generals are always thinking of asking His Majesty for help when something happens. Why didn't you try to fight the mercenaries? If you could win, would you still need to suffer these grievances?" Left Prime Minister, it's easy for you to say that. Hearing this, Den was a little angry. He was the general of the dynasty and belonged to the existence of the military leader. There was no need to talk about his authority. Although Ding Dingwei was the left prime minister, in reality he wasn't much stronger than him. Not to mention it was now a time of war, and the status of soldiers was greatly increased. How could he be afraid of the other party? Left Prime Minister, how could you not know that we didn't try to launch a counterattack? But the mercenaries have continuous fire guns that can take people's lives from hundreds of feet away. Our bows and arrows only have a range of 300 feet. How can we fight them? This general has ordered 2 attacks, but we didn't even see a single person and suffered heavy casualties. How can we fight such a battle? Left Prime Minister, please teach me. Of course, if Left Prime Minister is willing to personally lead the army, then I will give you a good set of armor. How about it? Asking a civil official to go to the battlefield to fight was clearly nonsense. How could Ding Dingwei answer? He coldly snorted and said, "Fine, since the army can't win, then let us civil officials negotiate with our mouths." Chapter 629. All right. De N nodded as if this was how it should be. This scene infuriated Ding Dingwei greatly. In the past, when there was a war, it was always the generals who were in charge of the war, and the civil officials who were in charge of the peace. But now, as soon as Dagon heard that they were going to negotiate, he agreed without hesitation. From this, it could be seen that they were really outnumbered by the mercenaries. If that was the case, wouldn't it mean that this time's negotiation wouldn't go smoothly? Now, he just hoped that the other party would not ask for too much. Ding Dingwei was destined to be disappointed. Although the mercenaries quickly gave an answer and welcomed them to the peace talks, when Ding Dingwei went to the mercenary camp the next day, he didn't see the famous Duke of Loyalty from the Great Ming Dynasty, but only 2 regimental political commissars. He knew that the peace talks this time wouldn't go so smoothly. He couldn't even see the main characters, which was a bad sign. The people who met Ding Dingwei were the political commissar of the 2nd Regiment, Kong Jie, and the political commissar of the 3rd Regiment, Qinbo. This was also Yang Chendong's intention to train these people's political skills. Of course, the 2 of them were prepared when they came. That was, Qinbo would play the good cop, and Kong Jie would play the bad cop. When the red and white figures first met with Ding Dingwei, they opened their mouths wide and proposed conditions that Ding Dingwei could not accept. According to the 2 political commissars, the war could be stopped, but the Phnom Penh dynasty had to submit to the Duke of Loyalty. At the same time, the entire Phnom Penh dynasty had to be divided into provinces like Vietnam and Laos. King Boromir had to leave the palace and be taken to a mysterious place according to the mercenaries. He would be put under house arrest for the rest of his life. The other ministers would have to hand over half of their property to protect themselves and so on. These were completely overbearing terms. One could imagine how dark Ding Dingwei's face would be when he heard this. Then he laughed out of anger. What's the difference between your demands and occupying the Phnom Penh dynasty by force? Of course there is. If we were to attack, a minister like you wouldn't be able to save your life just by handing over half of your wealth. Chen Bo, who was in charge of playing the bad guy, said without hesitation. Are you so confident that you can take down our gilded border dynasty? Don't you know that even a rabbit will bite when it's cornered? When we are both injured, Siam and Awa will join forces to attack. I'm afraid you will have to pay a heavy price. Ding Dingwei said in a threatening tone. He didn't believe that the mercenaries would be so bold as to not care about other countries. If that was the case, they wouldn't have just surrounded Suwang City. They would have directly attacked it. At this point, Chen Bo suddenly thought of something and said, "Oh right, the reason why you came here must be because you heard the news that we defeated the Siamese and Ava army. Yes, if you were willing to negotiate before this, we would still be able to do so. But now, either you surrender or wait for my mercenaries to blast your heart with their guns." Is this the opinion of the loyal duke? After feeling Chen Bo's tough attitude, Ding Wei knew that there would be no result if he continued to talk to this person, so he wanted to see the higher-ups. Perhaps it was easy to meet the king of hell, but difficult to deal with the little demons. This is not the opinion of the loyal duke, but the opinion of most of our military generals. Chen Bo turned his head and said with a very arrogant look. Just like that, the first meeting ended without any results. Just as Ding Wei returned to Suwang City with a belly full of anger, a few cannonballs suddenly flew over his head. One of them even landed not far from his team. He didn't know if it was a random shot or if it was done on purpose to give him a show of strength. The bombardment continued. There was no fixed time, no fixed location, and no fixed number of shells. It seemed that everything depended on the mood of the mercenaries. When he was in a good mood, he would only fire once every half a day. When he was in a bad mood, he would fire a few times, causing the people in the city to panic. Even the morale in the barracks was declining day by day. If General Dagon had not sent an inspection team to keep watch at the rear, there would have been many deserters. The atmosphere in the city became more and more serious, and the pressure on Ding Wei also increased. He went to the mercenary camp for 3 days in a row. One of the negotiators, Chen Bo, didn't treat him well. Although there was another negotiator, Kong Jia, who constantly adjusted the atmosphere in the middle, the negotiations didn't break down. The content didn't change much. Ding Wei had no choice but to write the situation in a memorial and send it back to the capital, Phnom Penh City. When the news reached the capital, King Boromir couldn't sit still. If the mercenaries were determined to take down Phnom Penh like how they took down Jiaoji and Lansong, then what could they use to stop them? Yes, they still had an army of more than 300,000 soldiers. If they fought, they would be able to cause a certain amount of damage to the mercenaries, or even severely injure them. This gave the two allied countries a chance to fight back. But in this way, Phnom Penh was destined to be turned into a sieve, or even destroyed. In this case, what benefits did it have to do with them? What should they do? Boromir, who was cursing Siam and Awa in his heart, could only think of a solution. Fortunately, there was good news at this time. The old eunuch beside him said that the right prime minister, Dun, had recovered. Although he wasn't as healthy as before, as long as he didn't do strenuous exercise, he wouldn't have any problems doing ordinary work. Quick, summon the right prime minister. When he heard the news, Boromir was like a person walking in the darkness who saw the light of dawn, and he shouted excitedly. Dun's illness was indeed cured. It was originally a self-inflicted cold. Because it was treated in time, it looked more serious 2 days ago. Now, he had been recuperating for more than a week. Naturally, he was fine. Of course, Dun was able to recover so quickly thanks to Yun Kei's help. Mr. Yun said that it was time for him to come back, and it was also time for him to make a contribution. With the left Prime Minister, Ding Wei, it would be very advantageous for Dun to take over the negotiations, especially in terms of conditions. The facts had proven that Yun Kei's words could be trusted. Of course, Dun had to stand up. At this time, he could be said to be in high spirits. Even when he followed the eunuch into the palace, he was still arrogant and confident. As Yun Kei said, the left prime minister hit a wall in the front line. The king didn't really want to fight with the mercenaries, and the negotiation force would become the mainstream. Naturally, it was time for him to perform. Because Yun Kei said that in the entire Golden Border dynasty, only he could handle the negotiation. Of course, in return, this time, he had to fight for a certain amount of rights for the mercenaries. For this reason, Dun basically agreed without hesitation. Perhaps others would think that he was betraying his country's rights, but only he knew that if he didn't, there would be someone else to take over this position. Not to mention, if he could protect the Golden Border dynasty at this time, it would be a great achievement. Not to mention, he could also attack the left Prime Minister, Ding Wei. This had always been his wish. Since he could make His Majesty happy, make the mercenaries happy, and make himself happy, why not do such a thing? Dun walked into the side hall and saw King Boromir sitting high above. He saw that the king's eyes lit up, and then his face was full of smiles. The right Prime Minister is here. This king's heart is at ease. Come, give the Prime Minister a seat. Giving a seat was a very high courtesy, and something like this had never happened before. Just this action alone could prove a lot of things. At this time, Dun's heart was at ease. After more than 2 hours, Dun walked out of the palace with a satisfied face. Boromir had approved that he would replace the left Prime Minister, Ding Wei, to negotiate with the mercenaries in Suwang. Not only that, the king even told Dun the bottom line. As long as he followed the bottom line, he would have more freedom to play. Early the next morning, Dun set off from Golden Border City and went straight to Suwang City. The Foreign Affairs Director of the Security Bureau, Yun Ke, was also with the convoy. With Dun's departure to the front line, his task was equivalent to more than 80% completed. The next step was to finalize some of the details of the negotiation. In fact, after Dun returned to his residence yesterday, he had an in-depth communication with Yun Ke about the negotiation. In this regard, Yun Ke had already been authorized by Yang Chendong, and his decision was the mercenaries' decision. Finally, after a sincere communication, the final plan of the negotiation was finalized. That was, the Golden Border dynasty made the following concessions. First, General Hun Sen publicly apologized to the Salangan family of Laos and compensated them with a total of 300,000 silver taels. In fact, the Salangan family's loss was only 170,000 silver taels. Second, the Golden Border dynasty would compensate the mercenaries with 1.5 million silver taels, which would be used as military funds for the mercenaries, and 500,000 tons of copper and iron. Third, cede Shangding City and all the territories north of the city to Laos. The mercenaries would withdraw to the north of Shangding City and would not infringe on the interests of the Golden Border dynasty without any reason. Fourth, the two sides would exchange business, each had its own independent sovereignty, and could station diplomatic missions to ensure a friendly relationship for generations. Once one side was attacked by others for no reason, the other side was obliged to send troops to help. That was to say, after these events, the Golden Border dynasty and Laos had formed a military alliance. Of course, the agreement was written that once a war broke out, the troops would be sent, but the number would depend on the mood. There was no specific number. In a way, it was not a breach of the contract to send only one person. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.